Imagine standing in near darkness, watching torchlight slide across temple walls where gods and kings stride larger than life. The stone remembers them perfectly, their victories, their conquests, their divine right to rule. Every surface tells the same story. Egypt was eternal, its pharaohs unstoppable, its order absolute. But walk those same chambers long enough, and something else begins to surface. A silence. A kind of emptiness that shouldn't exist in a civilization that carved its history into stone meant to outlast the stars. If Egypt wanted you to remember, why does so much feel missing? The monuments speak in one voice, triumphant, divine, unchanging. Yet the nation that built them ran on thousands of others. Cooks stirred pots in palace kitchens. Brickmakers hauled mud under the same sun that blessed the throne. Singers performed in temples where only priests were supposed to hear the gods. Midwives delivered children who would never appear in any royal chronicle. Scribes kept records of grain and copper, their hands stained with ink that mattered more to survival than any hymn. Riverboat crews navigated the Nile's floods, carrying the economy on their backs while statues of kings watched from the banks, silent and still. Where are their voices in the stone? They exist, but barely. Not in the grand halls or the tombs of eternity. They surface in fragments, letters scrawled on broken pottery, receipts for bread and beer, work logs tracking days and rations. These were never meant to last. Papyrus crumbles, clay cracks, wood rots. And yet these fragile scraps survive precisely because no one thought to destroy them. No pharaoh ordered them erased. No priest rewrote them into hymns. They were too small, too ordinary, too true to threaten the story Egypt wanted told. Because Egypt did tell a story, deliberately, powerfully. The stone wasn't just a record, it was a carefully staged performance, meant to be believed forever. When a pharaoh fell from favor, his name was chiseled away, his face hammered into dust. When a queen seized power in ways that made priests uncomfortable, her reign was softened, repositioned, sometimes erased entirely. When campaigns failed or famines struck, or the gods seemed absent, the stone stayed silent. Failures became hymns, defeats became divine tests. Chaos became order, retroactively, permanently, in letters 3 feet tall. This wasn't accident. It was method. Erasure as policy. The monuments weren't neutral, they were marketing. Ancient, patient, breathtakingly effective marketing designed to shape belief across millennia. And it worked. We see pyramids and think of power. We see hieroglyphs and think of mystery. We see gold masks and think of eternity. Rarely do we ask what was left out, or why, or who decided. The greatest illusions aren't the ones modern enthusiasts invented about lost civilizations or alien architects. Those are distractions, noise. The real illusion was older, subtler, and far more successful. It was the idea that what survived in stone was the whole truth, that history belonged to those who could afford to carve it, and that everyone else was somehow less real, less worthy of memory, less human. But they were there. The cooks, the builders, the singers, the mothers. They lived, worked, loved, suffered, and died in the same world the pharaohs claimed as theirs alone. They left marks small, fragile, unintentional. A complaint about wages, a love letter, a recipe, a joke, a prayer that had nothing to do with kings. These weren't meant to last, yet they did, scattered and overlooked, waiting in the cracks between the monuments. And if you know where to look, they tell a different story entirely. Not the one Egypt wanted told, the one that actually happened. The loudest truth about ancient Egypt may be written on what they used as a notepad and then threw away. While pharaohs commissioned eternal monuments, the people who kept the kingdom running needed something faster, cheaper, more disposable. Pottery shards, limestone flakes, scraps of broken jars. Anything with a smooth surface became a canvas for the urgent and the ordinary. A foreman needed to track rations, a merchant tallied deliveries, a worker filed a complaint, A mother left instructions for her daughter. None of it was meant to survive. All of it did, buried in trash heaps and forgotten corners, waiting for someone to notice that the kingdom's real voice wasn't carved in stone, it was scribbled in haste and discarded without ceremony. Imagine a morning in a riverside neighborhood, 3,000 years gone. Smoke rises from bread ovens, thick and sweet. Sandals slap through mud still wet from the Nile's retreat. Children chase geese between houses, pressed so close you can hear your neighbor's arguments through reed walls. A potter shapes clay, while his apprentice complains about the heat. A fisherman mends nets, fingers moving without thought, eyes on the water. Someone shouts about a missing sack of grain. Someone else laughs. The day smells like sweat and bread and river silt, and no pharaoh will ever write a hymn about any of it. Yet scholars can reconstruct scenes exactly like this, not from imagination, but from the plainest details left behind. A pottery shard records a late delivery of barley, 3 days overdue, specific quantities listed, a name attached to the failure. That name appears again in another fragment, this time receiving payment for bricks. Cross-reference enough shards and a person emerges, not a king, not a priest, but someone who worked, who owed, who was owed, who existed in a web of obligations as real as any temple ritual. Tally marks on limestone flakes reveal how many workers showed up each day, who was sick, who argued with the foreman, who left early. The details are so small they feel mundane. That's exactly why they matter. Because meaning hides in the mundane. A missing sack of grain isn't just an accounting error. It's evidence of theft, or drought, or corruption, or desperation. A complaint about wages isn't just workplace grumbling, it's proof that workers organized, protested, and sometimes won. An inventory of tools reveals what jobs mattered, what materials were scarce, what the kingdom valued beyond gold and gods. These fragments don't announce themselves as history. They were receipts, reminders, arguments, frozen mid-sentence. They were the paperwork of survival, and they tell the truth precisely because no one thought to lie on them. There was no audience, no legacy. Just a note to remember something that mattered today, not forever. And this is where the promise shifts. The most intimate Egypt, the one where people actually lived, is not buried in tombs surrounded by treasure and curses. It's scattered in trash heaps, abandoned in workrooms, mixed with sand and forgotten for millennia. The temples wanted you to believe in eternity. The trash heaps show you Tuesday. But here's the tension that begins to surface. Quiet and inevitable, like a locked door clicking open. These small sources don't always agree with the grand official version. Not loudly, not with drama. They just contradict. A king claims he fed his workers generously. The payroll records show strikes over missed rations. A temple inscription celebrates divine abundance. The grain inventories reveal desperation. The stone says one thing, the scraps say another. And the scraps were never meant to impress anyone. Which version do you trust? The one carved to last forever, or the one scribbled in haste and thrown away without a second thought? The people who left these marks didn't know they were leaving evidence. They were just trying to get through the day, to remember who owed what, to solve problems that felt urgent in the moment and meaningless a week later. But in doing so, they left a footprint clear, detailed, undeniable, and nowhere is that footprint deeper than in the world behind the pyramids, where thousands of ordinary people built eternity and wrote their complaints on broken pottery while they did it. What if the pyramids were not built by chained bodies, but by a system so advanced it feels uncomfortably modern? The story doesn't begin with the pyramid. It begins with bread. 10 loaves per worker, twice daily, recorded in tallies that track consumption like a payroll department. It begins with work gangs, not random crowds, but organized teams with names they chose themselves. Names etched into stone with something resembling pride. The drunkards of Menkaure, friends of Khufu, enduring gang. These weren't numbers, they were crews, units, identities. The rhythm of their Labor Day was structured, predictable, almost corporate. Sunrise assignments, midday rations, rotation schedules to prevent exhaustion, rest days built into the calendar. The apparatus that raised those monuments wasn't chaos held together by whips. It was logistics. For centuries, the image persisted: endless slaves dragging stone under brutal sun, faceless suffering in service to mad ego. It fit a narrative, tyranny carved in limestone, but evidence tells a different story, one that's both stranger and more human. The communities that kept royal dreams alive were purpose-built, planned down to housing layouts and grain storage. Workers weren't slaves, they were recruited, often seasonally, when the Nile flooded their farmland and left them idle. They were paid in rations, bread, beer, meat on festival days. They were fed well enough that their bones show they ate better than average Egyptians. Skeletal remains reveal healed fractures, proof of medical care, of value placed on recovery, of workers worth keeping alive and functional. This doesn't mean it was easy. The work was brutal. Limestone blocks weighed tons, copper tools dulled fast. Injuries were common: crushed fingers, broken bones, backs that gave out under decades of strain. Overseers watched, tracked, demanded quotas. The tension between duty and exhaustion lived in every shift. Some days workers showed up, some days they didn't, and the absence was recorded without obvious punishment, suggesting something closer to labor negotiation than slavery. Strikes happened. One work crew famously stopped because rations arrived late, not because they were starving, but because the delay broke an agreement. They had expectations, they had leverage, and they had names. Not all of them, but enough. Graffiti inside the pyramids themselves preserves crew identities, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with complaints, sometimes just with the stubborn need to say, "I was here." A foreman named Ankhaf, a sculptor called Ptahshepses, workers whose tombs, small and plain compared to royalty, still exist near the monuments they built, as if proximity to eternity mattered even in death. These weren't erased people. They were participants in a system that organized human effort on a scale most civilizations couldn't imagine, and they left traces of agency: arguments, pride, refusal, survival. The erased Egypt becomes tangible in moments like these. Not in the fantasy of anonymous suffering, but in the reality of people who argued with their supervisors, who mocked the Pharaohs' architects in scrawled asides, who negotiated for better beer and sometimes won. They carried the weight of stone and the weight of their own lives: marriages, children, debts, rivalries, hopes that had nothing to do with kings. The system that raised the pyramids was vast and often harsh, but it wasn't mindless. It was organized, strategic, and disturbingly familiar. Shift rotations, supply chains, middle management, workplace culture, compensation disputes. It feels modern because the problems of coordinating large groups toward impossible goals haven't changed. Only the tools have. But workforce statistics, however revealing, don't capture what it felt like to live inside that machine. They don't tell you what these people ate when rations ran short, what they feared when accidents happened, what they celebrated when a section was finally finished and the overseers allowed rest. They don't tell you what workers wrote home about when the day ended and the torches burned low, the complaints, the gossip, the love, the boredom, the small rebellions that happened in the margins when no one important was listening. That world, the one hidden in the cracks between monuments and myth, is where the story goes next. Not to the labor machine that raised stone toward the sky, but to the daily existence of the workers themselves, where survival and status and quiet resistance lived side by side, and where the real Egypt, the one that never made it onto temple walls, left its deepest marks. In the world behind the pyramids, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a whip, it was an empty granary. Picture the settlement at dusk, when the day's heat finally breaks and the stone stops radiating like a forge. Rows of modest homes pressed together, their walls built from the same limestone chips left over from royal projects. Shared ovens glow in courtyards where women bake bread in shifts, the rhythm of their work older than any pharaoh's name. Storage rooms line narrow lanes worn smooth by thousands of feet moving in predictable patterns, morning to worksite, evening back home, the geography of routine carved into dust. This wasn't makeshift. It was planned. Streets laid out in grids, housing assigned by work gang, everything designed to keep a state project running, not with legend or divine mandate, but with logistics. Grain arrived by riverboat, tracked in ledgers before it touched ground. Distribution happened on schedule, 10 loaves per man, a jug of beer, meat when the calendar allowed. Medical care existed, basic but present, because injured workers slowed production. Tool repair had its own dedicated crews, because broken copper chisels meant broken quotas. Scribes sat in shaded corners, recording everything: who worked, who rested, who complained, who received extra rations for dangerous tasks. The system hummed with the efficiency of necessity. Thousands of people needed feeding, housing, managing. The pyramid demanded it. But rations weren't just sustenance. They were power. Who received more beer-held status, recognition for skill, for loyalty, for being someone the foreman noticed? Who lost portions carried shame, a visible demotion that everyone saw when the day's allotment was handed out? Who got blamed when supplies ran thin-faced consequences that rippled through family and reputation? Food was currency, leverage, punishment, reward. In a place where you couldn't leave, where your labor belonged to the crown and your choices narrowed to compliance or consequences, control over your next meal was control over your life. Small conflicts surfaced in that pressure. A copper chisel goes missing from the tool shed. Was it stolen, lost, or hidden by a worker tired of the foreman's abuse? The scribe's tally shows 3 men absent, but the foreman insists only 2 stayed behind. Whose count matters more? And what happens to the worker caught in the middle? A jar of oil meant for lamps gets used for something else, something personal. And now the night shift works in darkness while someone answers for the theft. These weren't grand dramas. They were the friction of people living too close, working too hard, under too much scrutiny, with too little room for error. Yet the settlement wasn't silent obedience. People negotiated. A skilled stonecutter could demand better housing, and sometimes he got it. A crew that finished early might bargain for extra rest. And occasionally the foreman agreed, because keeping morale high mattered more than squeezing 1 more hour from exhausted men. Complaints were recorded, not ignored. Recorded, which means someone was listening, or at least pretending to. And sometimes, when the balance shifted too far, when the pressure exceeded tolerance, people refused, not with violence, not with rebellion that would bring soldiers, but with the quiet, devastating power of stopping. The settlement felt orderly because the order was maintained through constant negotiation, constant pressure, constant awareness that this machine only worked if enough people chose, each day, to keep moving. Take away the food, and the choice became simpler. Take away the promise that tomorrow's rations would arrive, and loyalty meant nothing against hunger. And hunger, unlike loyalty, doesn't negotiate. The workers knew this. The scribes knew this. The foremen who shouted orders, and the architects who drew plans, and the priests who blessed foundations, everyone knew that the entire apparatus rested on grain shipments, arriving on time, every time, without fail. The pyramid was stone, but the system that raised it was bread. Miss 1 delivery, and cracks appeared. Miss several, and the cracks widened. Eventually, someone would test what happened when the promised food didn't arrive, when the granaries stayed empty, when the workers woke up and realized that the power holding them in place was the same power they could take away by simply refusing to move. That question, what happens when hunger becomes louder than loyalty, wasn't theoretical. It was tested. And the answer, preserved in records the state never meant as advertisement, reveals something history rarely credits. The people who built eternity knew exactly how much leverage they had. And when the moment came, they used it. The rations were late. Not by hours, by days. The boats that should have arrived with grain sat somewhere upriver, delayed by bureaucracy or drought or corruption no one would name aloud. Officials offered excuses that sounded rehearsed. Storage issues, logistical complications, patience requested. The workers listened, then they waited. Then the waiting turned into something harder to swallow than hunger. It started as murmurs between shifts. A stonecutter mentions his children asking for bread he doesn't have. A carpenter says his wife is rationing their last supplies. The conversation spread through the settlement like smoke low, persistent, impossible to ignore. No one shouts, no one threatens, but in the spaces between hammering and hauling, men exchange looks that carry weight. The heat doesn't help. It never does. Tempers shorten when stomachs tighten, and the sun doesn't care about promises or protocols. Then someone says what everyone is thinking. Why are we still working? It's not a call to riot. It's a question that hangs in the air until it becomes a decision. The next morning, instead of walking to the worksite, the men gather in a place where they will be seen near the administrative buildings, close enough to the officials who issue orders and record complaints. They sit, not in formation, not with weapons, just bodies refusing to move. The act is simple, almost polite, but the message is unmistakable. No food, no work. The emotional texture of that moment is difficult to name. There's shame in it, grown men pleading for what was promised, what they earned, what keeps their families alive. There's courage, too, the kind that comes from realizing you're not alone, that the man beside you is just as tired, just as angry, just as willing to risk consequences. And beneath it all, a quiet terror. This is a civilization obsessed with order. Defying authority here doesn't mean getting fired. It means facing a system that sees resistance as chaos, and chaos as unforgivable. Every man sitting in that dust knows what could happen. They sit anyway. The officials arrive, flustered and cautious. Negotiations happen. Not immediately, not easily, but they happen. The workers don't demand revolution, they demand their rations. The state, faced with the prospect of a halted project and the embarrassment of visible unrest, finds the grain. Deliveries resume, the men return to work, order reasserts itself, but something fundamental has shifted. The workers proved a point they probably knew all along. The pyramid needs them more than they need the pyramid. Here's the twist that history tried to bury in administrative paperwork. This is one of the earliest recorded labor strikes. Not a modern invention, not a product of industrial revolution or Enlightenment thought. Ancient Egypt, under the gaze of temples and kings, witnessed organized labor action, and someone wrote it down not to celebrate it, but because strikes were unusual enough to require documentation, common enough to have procedures for handling them. This is an everyday truth the royal story would rather forget. Workers were not faceless hands shaping eternity at the whim of divine rulers. They were a collective force, capable of strategy, solidarity, and refusal. They understood leverage. They used it. And they won, if only temporarily, if only partially, in ways that never made it onto temple walls but survived in records kept by the very officials who had to negotiate with them. Which raises a question the monuments won't answer. What other ordinary dramas hide in the shadows of official grandeur? What other moments of resistance, negotiation, and quiet rebellion were too common, too human, too threatening to the curated image of absolute power? The strike was documented because it disrupted order. How much disruption happened that was never written down at all, resolved in whispers, forgotten by design, erased not with hammers but with silence? The workers who sat in that dust and demanded their bread didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to survive. But in doing so, they left proof that even in a kingdom built on divine authority and eternal stone, power had limits. And those limits were tested every day, in smaller ways, quieter ways, in homes where families negotiated survival, in relationships where love became another form of resistance, in the private bargains people made to endure a world that wanted them invisible. If a civilization can build pyramids, what did it do with heartbreak inside a two-room home? The public world ended at the doorway. Inside, the walls were thin mud brick and reed, close enough to hear neighbors argue, laugh, weep through the night. Privacy was a luxury most couldn't afford, yet people carved out intimacy anyway, in routines that felt eternal even when nothing else did. A woman grinds grain before dawn, the stone's rhythm older than her grandmother's grandmother. Linen soaks in a clay basin, waiting for hands that will scrub and wring and hang it to dry under a sun that bleaches everything eventually. Children sleep on mats while parents speak in low tones, voices careful not to wake what doesn't need waking. By lamplight, stories are told, not the ones carved in temples, but the ones families keep, about ancestors and mistakes and lessons learned too late. Beer shared at dusk becomes communion. Not the sacred kind, though it feels close. Just people sitting after the day empties them, passing a jar, letting exhaustion soften into something bearable. These moments don't announce themselves as history. They're survival, companionship, the quiet architecture of a life lived in the margins of someone else's monument. Status showed up in small ways, details that separated one household from the next even when the differences were razor thin. A low wooden stool instead of sitting on the floor. A bronze mirror, polished until it caught your face. Kohl for the eyes. Not just protection from sun glare, but a statement that you had access, that someone thought you worth adorning. A better cut of meat on festival days, proof that your work mattered enough to be rewarded with something beyond bread and beer. Furniture simple, sparse, but present marked the gap between subsistence and stability. Most people lived close to scarcity, one bad season from losing what little separated them from desperation. Yet they wrote, not grand inscriptions meant for eternity, but notes to each other, fragments of communication that survived because papyrus and pottery shards were everywhere, and writing was common enough to be useful. A letter to a son working upriver. Send word when you arrive. Your mother worries. A property dispute between brothers, each claiming land their father never divided clearly. The anger bleeding through tersely worded complaints. An apology, brief and awkward, from a husband who left and returned and needed forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. A demand for payment, polite but firm, from a creditor who knows desperation when he sees it. And marriage contracts. Separations. Blended families navigating the complications of previous unions. Stepchildren. Divided loyalties. Grief captured in a few lines. She was taken before her time. The economy of language doesn't diminish the weight. If anything, it amplifies it. These were people who couldn't afford to waste words on sentimentality, yet they found space for it anyway, between the practical clauses and the tallies of goods exchanged. Ancient Egypt, so often portrayed as stiff and ceremonial, preserved evidence of tenderness that breaks the myth. A father writes instructions for his daughter's wedding. A widow argues for her rights to her late husband's property, and wins. A couple negotiates terms before marriage, who keeps what if things fall apart, how children will be supported, what happens if one of them dies. It's legal, yes, but it's also proof that people thought ahead, that they planned for both hope and failure, that love and pragmatism coexisted in the same breath. The erased theme deepens here. The kings are loud because their lives were performances staged for an audience of eternity. Every statue, every inscription, every tomb was a script meant to convince the gods and the future that they mattered. But common people didn't perform, they just lived. And because they weren't trying to impress anyone beyond their immediate circle, what survived feels startlingly real. A complaint about a neighbor's goats. A recipe. A joke that doesn't translate but clearly meant something once. A name scratched into a wall with no context, just the need to say, I existed here. Inside those thin-walled homes, history wasn't grand. It was grain and linen and lamplight, and the small negotiations that make sharing space possible. It was heartbreak that didn't stop the day's work. It was love that had to fit between exhaustion and responsibility. It was the knowledge that tomorrow would come, demanding the same things today demanded, and the quiet agreement to face it together or alone, if that's what survival required. And in those homes, Among those routines and compromises and tender moments that no pharaoh ever thought to commemorate, some of the most powerful figures in ancient Egypt moved quietly, holding influence the official record barely acknowledged. Women, mothers, wives, daughters, priestesses, businesswomen whose lives the next chapter cannot ignore. The grand temples dazzled outsiders, but the real engine of Egypt was bread, beer, and favors traded in quiet alleys. Dawn doesn't announce itself gently here. It arrives with work already waiting. Hands knead dough before the heat becomes unbearable, working flour and water into shapes that will feed a family or two, or be traded for something needed more urgently than bread. The rhythm is practiced. Automatic push, fold, turn, while children wake and begin their own small responsibilities. One carries water from the river, the clay jar heavy against a hip, too young to carry it comfortably, but old enough to know there's no choice. Another sweeps the threshold, pushing yesterday's dust into the street where it joins everyone else's dust. Another feeds the chickens, if the family has chickens, or watches a neighbor's geese in exchange for eggs. If they don't. This is survival as a system of skills. Baking, brewing beer, which takes days and attention and produces something more valuable than water, because water can kill you, but beer, fermented and safe, keeps you alive. Weaving not elaborate textiles for the wealthy, but practical cloth that holds up under use, that can be mended, that serves until it can't, and then becomes rags for other purposes. Repairing sandals, reshaping clay pots, rethatching roofs before the wind finds the weak spots. Every household is a small economy, every person a collection of competencies that overlap and support the whole. But survival doesn't happen in isolation. The local economy runs on exchanges the official records barely mention. A woman who brews exceptional beer trades it for vegetables she can't grow in her small courtyard. A carpenter fixes a neighbor's doorframe and receives oil in return, the kind used for lamps and cooking, precious enough to track carefully. A midwife delivers a child and is paid in cloth, or grain, or a promise that will be remembered when she needs help herself. Favors accumulate like currency. Who you know, who owes you, who you can call on when stability wobbles, that's wealth too. Maybe more reliable than the kind you can hold. Because stability does wobble. One missed harvest and grain reserves dwindle. One illness and the person who brings in most of the household's trade goods can't work, can't negotiate, can't maintain the relationships that keep the family fed. The margin between security and desperation is thinner than most want to admit. People measure time not by abstract calendars but by the flood's arrival, by festival days when rations increase, by the seasons that dictate what work is possible and what must wait. They stretch resources with ingenuity because abundance is rare and wastefulness is dangerous. Bread goes stale, so it's softened in beer and eaten anyway. Cloth wears thin, so it's patched and repatched until it becomes something else entirely. A sling for carrying, a wrap for an infant, stuffing for a cushion someone wealthier might sit on. Here's the quiet twist. Wealth in Egypt, for most people, wasn't coins. Coins barely existed. Wealth was grain stored in jars, counted and recounted, rationed carefully through lean months. It was cloth, stacked and guarded, because good linen took time and skill and could be traded for almost anything. It was social ties, being the person others trusted, the one who kept promises, whose word meant future reciprocity. The elite glittered with gold and alabaster, yes, but they glittered because thousands of ordinary transactions kept them fed, dressed, and clean. Someone baked their bread, someone brewed their beer, someone wove their linen, harvested their grain, carried their water, cleaned their floors. The temples dazzled with light and incense, but the light came from oil pressed by hands that never entered those halls, and the incense was carried by workers who measured their own wealth in bread rations and favors owed. So the question forms, quiet and persistent. If survival required this much precision, this much care, this constant negotiation between scarcity and need, what did people do when they wanted more than survival? When they desired beauty, or status, or to be seen as something beyond functional? When they looked at their reflection in a bronze mirror or a still pool and wondered if they could shape not just how they survived, but how they were remembered. The famous Egyptian eyeliner wasn't merely fashion, its purpose may have been far more practical and a little unsettling. Look closely at any tomb painting, any statue meant to preserve a face for eternity. And the pattern repeats, dark lines extending from the eyes, bold and precise, framing vision like architecture. It's become iconic, the Egyptian look, replicated in costume parties and museum exhibits, reduced to aesthetic. But step back from the image and into the reality of the person wearing it, and the reasons multiply. That kohl wasn't just decoration, it was defense. The sun here doesn't forgive. Glare off limestone and sand can damage eyes over years of exposure, and the dark pigment ground from galena, stibnite, malachite reduced that glare the way modern athletes wear eye black. Flies carried disease, and infections could cost vision, or worse. The kohl's antimicrobial properties, accidental chemistry discovered through trial and need, offered protection that people may not have fully understood but absolutely relied on. And beneath the practical lived something deeper. The eyes were spiritually vulnerable, gateways that needed guarding. Lining them was ritual as much as routine, a daily assertion that you controlled what entered and what was kept out. Cosmetics carried weight beyond appearance. A particular shade of red ochre on the lips and cheeks signaled status, access to trade routes, to imported materials, to time that wasn't consumed by pure survival. Perfumes, laboriously prepared from resins, flowers, and oils, masked the smells of a world without plumbing but also announced presence. You were noticed before you were seen. Hairstyles, often elaborate, required help proof that you had family, friends, resources. Wigs made from human hair, sometimes blended with plant fibers, covered heads shaved to avoid lice but also became canvases for identity. Jewelry beads of faience, copper bangles, amulets shaped like scarabs or protective deities wasn't mere adornment. Each piece carried meaning, intention, hope that the right symbols worn close to skin might shift fate in your favor. These objects were sourced through networks that stretched across deserts and seas. Frankincense from Punt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, kohl ingredients mined and ground and traded hand to hand until they reached a small dish in a worker's home. Preparation was intimate, often shared. A mother teaches her daughter to mix the pigment with oil, to apply it without smudging, to understand that presentation is a form of care for yourself, for how others perceive you, for the fragile line between respect and dismissal. Personal style became both self-expression and armor, against the sun that aged skin prematurely, against insects that saw exposed flesh as opportunity, against the judgment of a society that read appearance as character. Looking worn meant you were worn. Looking polished, even when resources were thin, meant you hadn't given up, hadn't let circumstances erase the part of you that still wanted to be seen as more than functional. Yet the official images, those perfect bodies painted on tomb walls, those statues with flawless skin and eternal youth tell only half the truth. The bones buried beneath tell the rest. Worn joints from repetitive labor. Healed fractures that set imperfectly because medical care, while present, had limits. Spines compressed from years of carrying weight. Teeth ground down from bread, contaminated with sand and grit. Calloused hands, evidence of pain managed, not erased. The society famous for eternal beauty lived with constant physical strain, and the two realities coexisted without contradiction because they had to. So people adorned themselves knowing their bodies were breaking down, knowing tomorrow would demand the same brutal work today demanded. They shaped their appearance not in denial of that reality but in defiance of it. The kohl said, "I still have eyes worth protecting." The perfume said, "I am more than sweat and exhaustion." The jewelry said, "I carry meaning beyond what my labor produces." Beauty, in this context, wasn't vanity. It was insistence, a refusal to disappear into the role assigned by necessity. And beneath all of it, the cosmetics, the rituals, The careful presentation, lived structures that dictated what you could own, who you could marry, and what happened to everything you built when your life ended. Rules that shaped existence as surely as any eyeliner shaped a face. And just as deliberately, the next surprise sounds too modern to be real. In a world of pharaohs, some women could still sign their own power into existence. Imagine two families meeting in the shade of a courtyard, voices calm but stakes high. A marriage is being arranged not with romance, though that might exist, but with negotiation. The groom's father lists what his son brings: a plot of land, tools, access to a trade network. The bride's father counters with her dowry: linen she wove herself, grain stored from harvests, jewelry passed down through her mother's line. A scribe sits nearby, recording each item with strokes so deliberate they feel contractual. Because they are. This isn't sentiment, it's security. The terms being written aren't just about joining households. They're insurance against futures both families have seen unravel. What happens if the husband dies? The wife keeps her property, her dowry, the means to survive without remarrying immediately out of desperation. What happens if the marriage fails? She can leave, taking what she brought and sometimes more, depending on whose fault the failure was. What if he takes another wife? A common practice among those who could afford it. The contract specifies her rights, her share, what cannot be taken from her even if affection fades or new alliances form. The woman at the center of this negotiation isn't silent. In many periods, she could speak for herself, add conditions, refuse terms that left her vulnerable. She could own property, outright land, livestock, goods independent of her husband. If widowed, she inherited. If divorced, she walked away with assets that remained legally hers. If someone wronged her in business, she could take them to court, and the records show she sometimes won. This wasn't universal, wasn't guaranteed, and varied across Egypt's long history. But it happened often enough that the evidence isn't exceptional, it's routine. Dry, practical, and therefore powerful. A woman named Naunacht, for instance, left a will disinheriting children who neglected her in old age, rewarding those who showed care. Her decision was recorded, legally binding, proof that she controlled what she spent a lifetime accumulating. Another document details a woman suing her brother over inherited land. The dispute settled in her favor because the contract their father left was clear and she had witnesses. These aren't legends. They're administrative records, the unglamorous paperwork of a legal system that recognized women as participants, not just property. Families used writing to prevent future betrayal, to create certainty in a world where verbal promises dissolved under pressure. Marriage contracts specified who paid for the wedding feast. Divorce agreements tracked who owed what to whom. Inheritance documents named heirs and excluded relatives who didn't deserve inclusion. Every line was deliberate, every witness recorded, every seal pressed into clay, a statement that this agreement would outlast memory and temper. Yet rights written on papyrus did not always equal safety in real life. A woman could own land, but if powerful neighbors wanted it, legal ownership might not protect her without family or resources to enforce those rights. She could initiate divorce, but leaving a marriage meant navigating social consequences, judgment, lost status, the practical difficulty of survival outside a household structure. She could go to court, but courts favored those with influence, and influence often required wealth or connections she might not have. The law created possibilities, but possibilities aren't guarantees. Still, the documents reveal something the grand monuments never bothered to mention. Women moved through this world as agents, not background. They bought and sold. They testified and sued. They wrote wills and demanded justice. And beyond the domestic contracts, beyond marriage and inheritance, they held roles that shaped the kingdom in ways the official narrative often minimized. Economic roles running businesses, managing estates, controlling resources, religious roles, serving as priestesses, holding titles, performing rituals only they could perform. Even political roles, rare but real, where a woman's voice carried weight in decisions that affected more than her household. The evidence exists, scattered and partial, waiting in the same administrative debris that preserved strikes and complaints and work logs. The lives of women, like the lives of workers, survived because someone needed to write them down for reasons that had nothing to do with remembering them. And what survived reveals a complexity the monuments never admit. Power in ancient Egypt wore many faces, and some of those faces were female, moving through spaces and wielding influence that later histories preferred to forget. If women were invisible, why do so many documents treat them as people everyone had to negotiate with? The question isn't rhetorical. It's the gap between what the monuments show and what the documents say. Walk through a temple, and you see kings, gods, priests, male authority carved in stone meant to last forever. But sit with the letters, the contracts, the receipts, and a different Egypt surfaces. Women appear not as background, not as decoration, but as active participants whose decisions shaped households, businesses, and communities in ways the stone never bothered to commemorate. They weren't a single category. That's the first thing the evidence makes clear. A farmer's wife managing grain storage during flood season held different power than a priestess controlling temple revenues, but both held power. An artisan producing textiles for trade operated differently than a midwife whose reputation determined which families called for her when labor began, but both had leverage. Estate managers, women overseeing land, workers, and production appear in records alongside male counterparts, their authority documented in the same administrative language. Singers performed in temples and wealthy homes, their voices part of rituals that connected earth to divine, their presence required for ceremonies to function properly. The moments that survive show supervision, not servitude. A woman stands over brewing vats, not stirring herself but directing those who do. Her knowledge of fermentation timing and ingredient ratios essential to producing beer worth trading. Another negotiates prices in a marketplace. The back and forth captured in a dispute where she refuses to accept less than her goods are worth and wins. A tomb painting shows a couple standing side by side, equal in size, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that reads as partnership rather than possession. These aren't isolated exceptions. They appear too often, across too many contexts, to be anomalies. Silence in stone does not equal absence in life. The temples focused on eternity, on cosmic order, on kings mediating between humanity and gods. They had no reason to commemorate a woman running a successful textile workshop or a widow managing her late husband's estate better than he did. But the documents that tracked daily transactions, legal disputes, and property transfers couldn't avoid mentioning women because those transactions involved them. A man couldn't sell land without his wife's consent if she had legal claim to it. A business partnership included women as investors and beneficiaries. Inheritance moved through daughters as well as sons, and the records show women fighting to protect what was theirs, sometimes against brothers, sometimes against new wives their widowed fathers took. Some women held titles that tied them directly to temples and the wealth concentrated there. Chantress of Amun, priestess of Hathor, overseer of the House of Weavers. These weren't honorary positions. They came with responsibilities, access, and economic power. Temples weren't just religious centers, they were landowners, employers, distributors of resources. A woman with a temple title could control significant material wealth, could employ workers, could influence who received patronage and who didn't. Religion and economics intertwined so completely that spiritual authority translated into real-world leverage. The Egypt most people imagine a rigid male hierarchy where women existed only in domestic shadows doesn't fully match the textured evidence. That image comes from the monuments, from the official story meant to project unchanging order. But the actual society, the one people lived in, was messier and more negotiable. Women owned, women sued, women hired and fired, women made contracts that bound others to obligations. They weren't doing this in secret or in defiance of social norms, they were doing it within systems that recognized their capacity to act. Which raises the larger question the evidence keeps circling. How did religion amplify or restrict women's influence? Because temples were where wealth concentrated, where authority was claimed, where proximity to the divine could be translated into earthly power. And if women held titles there, if they performed rituals only they could perform, if their presence was necessary for the gods to be properly served, then what did that mean for their status beyond the temple walls? How much leverage did a priestess hold when she controlled access to divine favor? When her rituals kept cosmic order intact? When offending her might anger powers no pharaoh could override? The temple wasn't just a place to pray, it was a machine of land and labor, and some women stood close to its controls. Enter a temple ceremony at dusk, when light slants through high windows and catches particles of incense, smoke rising in slow spirals. The air tastes of myrrh and frankincense, resins carried from distant coasts and burned to make the space feel separate from the ordinary world outside. Chanting begins, voices layered in harmonies that predate written music, rhythms held in memory and pass throat to throat across generations. Women move through the ritual space in linen so fine it's nearly transparent. Fabric that cost more to produce than most families earned in a season. Sistrums shake metal rattles that sound like rain, like wind through reeds, like something between earth and elsewhere. The ceremony unfolds with precision. Each gesture rehearsed until it becomes automatic. Each word pronounced exactly as it must be for the gods to listen. This is the visible part, the performance, the mystery that visitors remember. But step back from the incense and the music, and the practical machinery reveals itself. Temples weren't only houses of worship, they were landholders controlling vast estates. They were employers managing hundreds or thousands of workers. Farmers, bakers, brewers, weavers, guards, scribes. They were storehouses accumulating grain, oil, cloth, and precious materials that could be redistributed, traded, or held as leverage. A temple functioned as a bank, a corporation, a government agency, all wrapped in sacred authority that made its economic power harder to challenge. And the people who held positions within that structure, who performed the rituals, who managed the resources, who controlled access to divine favor, wielded influence that extended far beyond prayer. Women occupied crucial roles in this system. Not all women, not equally, but visibly enough that the records can't erase them. Chantresses performed music essential to rituals. Without their voices, ceremonies were incomplete, offerings unacceptable, cosmic balance disrupted. Priestesses of Hathor, goddess of love and joy, and drunkenness and music, didn't just honor the deity, they managed temple resources, supervised workers, controlled distributions. The title God's Wife of Ammon, held by elite women connected to royal families, came with estates, staff, and authority that rivaled high priests. These weren't symbolic positions. They were jobs with responsibilities, budgets, and power. Religion wasn't only belief. It was infrastructure. The gods needed feeding daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, incense. Someone had to produce those offerings, transport them, prepare them, present them correctly. The gods owned land, vast holdings, worked by people who owed labor or taxes. Someone had to manage that land, collect the yields, ensure the system functioned. The gods required appeasement rituals timed to festivals, to floods, to celestial events. Someone had to know when and how and what would satisfy divine expectation. That knowledge was power, access to it, control over it, the ability to say, this is proper, or this offends the gods that shaped outcomes in the material world. And spiritual roles could shift economic realities. A woman serving as priestess brought her family closer to temple resources. She created networks, obligations, opportunities for relatives and allies. She could advocate, intervene, use her position to protect interests or advance ambitions. When disputes arose, having a priestess in the family meant having someone whose word carried sacred weight, whose judgment might be deferred to because challenging her meant risking divine displeasure. The divine imagery itself reinforced female power in ways the monuments captured, but didn't always translate into daily practice. Goddesses weren't decorative. Isis, Hathor, Mut, Sekhmet, they embodied forces essential to existence: maternal power, creative force, destructive capability, cosmic balance. The official theology insisted that without female divine energy, creation collapsed. Yet translating that high symbolism into respect for actual women was inconsistent, negotiable, dependent on context and status, and who held leverage in specific moments. Still, the performers of the official divine order were not always men. Women chanted, women danced, women shook sistrums and poured libations, and ensured the gods received what kept them satisfied. The rituals happened daily, endlessly, the same sacred theatre repeated until it became the rhythm Egypt moved to. And within that rhythm, some women found space to matter not as exceptions, but as necessary parts of a system that couldn't function without them. If a queen could be carved out of history, what chance did an ordinary woman ever have to be remembered? The names feel familiar even before you learn them. Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, Cleopatra. They've been mythologized, romanticized, reduced to images on museum posters and costume dramas. But step closer to the actual evidence, the inscriptions, the altered monuments, the gaps where names should be, and something darker emerges. These weren't fairy tales. They were women navigating a world built on succession anxiety, where the throne passed through bloodlines that twisted and doubled back on themselves, where legitimacy was performance and power was always one death away from chaos. Royal women existed in a strange position. They carried the blood that legitimized kings. A pharaoh's authority often depended on whom he married, which daughter of which previous ruler he could claim as his wife, binding his reign to the dynasty that came before. Queens weren't decorative. They were structural. Their bodies produced heirs. Their lineage validated rule. Their presence in ceremonies reinforced cosmic order, the king and queen, as earthly reflections of divine pairs, Osiris and Isis, maintaining balance between chaos and creation. Some women went further. They reached authority that had nothing to do with standing beside a king and everything to do with holding power themselves. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh, not regent, not queen pharaoh. She wore the false beard, the royal regalia, commissioned monuments in her own name, and reigned for over 2 decades with apparent stability and success. Sobneferu took the throne when her dynasty had no male heirs, ruling in her own right. Tawazret did the same centuries later. These weren't anomalies hidden in obscure records. They were women who commanded armies, directed building projects, made treaties, and governed with the full apparatus of kingship behind them. Yet their stories were reshaped. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced after her death, her name chiseled away, her images recarved as male kings or erased entirely. For a long time, scholars assumed this was revenge, punishment for a woman daring to claim what belonged to men. But the timing suggests something more calculated. The erasure happened decades after her death, during a period when her successor wanted to clarify the royal line, to eliminate confusion about succession. She wasn't erased because she failed. She was erased because she succeeded. And that success complicated the story later rulers wanted to tell. This is where the twist lands with chilling quiet. Erasure wasn't only about enemies. It was about inconvenience, about narratives that didn't fit, about a woman who proved power didn't always require a king's body, which meant the entire justification for male-only succession became negotiable. If one woman could rule successfully as pharaoh, why not others? If divine order allowed it once, what prevented it again? The monuments couldn't answer those questions, so they removed the evidence that prompted them. Other royal women were praised when useful, diminished when threatening. A queen who produced the right heir was celebrated in art and inscription. A queen who maneuvered too visibly in politics found her titles quietly reduced in later records. Daughters of pharaohs married their brothers, their half-brothers, their uncles' royal incest designed to keep bloodlines pure and power concentrated, but also creating webs of loyalty and rivalry that could destabilize as easily as they could secure. A woman in that position held leverage: her womb, her lineage, her connections to factions within the court. But leverage cuts both ways. It makes you necessary. It also makes you dangerous. And if even royalty could be edited, if women who commanded kingdoms could be hammered out of stone, their names silenced, their reigns rewritten or erased, then what chance did ordinary women have? What chance did anyone outside the royal circle have to be remembered as they actually were, rather than as later powers needed them to be? The answer is the same for queens and commoners. Memory in Egypt was engineered, deliberately, constantly. The monuments weren't neutral records. They were arguments about who mattered, carved in stone and updated when the argument changed. The official story was a performance, staged and restaged, with actors written in or out, depending on what the current regime wanted history to say. But here's what the erasers couldn't fully destroy. Ordinary people didn't live inside the official story. They lived in kitchens and streets and dreams, where religion wasn't distant statues or grand theology. It was daily, intimate, woven into every decision and fear and hope. The gods weren't abstractions. They were companions, protectors, threats, explanations for why things happened and what might be done about it. And that faith, messy, personal, constant, held society together in ways no pharaoh's propaganda could, because it belonged to everyone, not just the ones carved in stone. What if the most important temple in Egypt was a corner of someone's kitchen? The grand stone structures with their towering columns and carved gods, those were for pharaohs, priests, the cosmic machinery of state religion. But the faith that shaped daily life happened in smaller spaces. A shelf in the corner of a room where a clay figure of Bez, the dwarf god, stood guard. A painted image of Taweret, the hippo goddess, watching over a pregnant woman's bed. A whispered prayer before stepping onto a boat, asking the river to stay calm, to not take what it had no right to take. Religion here wasn't theology. It was reflex, protection, a way of negotiating with forces that felt as present as neighbors and far more dangerous. Ordinary fear drove most of it. Illness arrived without warning, fever that wouldn't break, a cough that deepened, a wound that festered despite cleaning. Childbirth killed mothers and infants with brutal regularity, and no amount of skill or care guaranteed survival. Accidents happened on the river, in the fields, at work sites where a single mistake could crush bone or end life. People lived close to death, close to loss, and they needed answers for why tragedy struck and what might prevent it next time. So they performed rituals, small ones, constant ones. A mother tied an amulet around her child's neck, a scarab, an eye of Horus, a symbol meant to deflect harm. A farmer poured a libation before planting, offering beer to gods who controlled flood and harvest. A traveller left bread at a crossroads shrine, payment for safe passage. These weren't grand ceremonies. They were daily negotiations, insurance against a world that felt unpredictable and often cruel. The intimacy of belief shows in how people address the divine, not with formal distance, but like neighbors you had to live beside. Gods were pleaded with when things went wrong. Amun, hear my voice, my child is sick, and I have nothing left to offer but this prayer. They were blamed when pleas went unanswered. Why did you turn away? What did I do to deserve this? They were thanked when luck held. You protected my husband on the water. I will remember. The relationship was reciprocal, transactional, and deeply personal. You gave offerings. The gods gave favor. If the balance broke, someone wasn't keeping their side of the agreement. This was Egyptian religion too personal, improvised, local, far from the polished temple scenes carved in stone where everything is order and perfection. In homes, religion was messy, desperate, creative. People combined traditions, borrowed protective symbols from different cults, made up prayers when the old ones didn't seem to work. No priest supervised. No official doctrine corrected them. Belief belonged to the people who needed it, and they shaped it to fit their fears. Festivals broke the routine and reminded everyone that religion wasn't only about appeasing dangers, It was also about joy, release, the permission to stop working and exist differently for a day. During the Festival of Drunkenness, honoring Hathor, people drank until they couldn't stand, music pounded through streets, and the boundary between devotion and ecstasy dissolved. The gods demanded celebration as much as sacrifice. Pleasure was ritual. Community was worship. The festivals created space where the weight of survival lifted, where people remembered that life wasn't only endurance. But here's the tension building beneath it all. When religion is everywhere, in kitchens and streets, in personal prayers and public festivals, woven into every fear and hope, who actually controls it? The people performing their small rituals? The priests interpreting divine will from temple halls? The state using belief to justify authority and maintain order? All three claimed ownership, and the boundaries between them were never quite clear. Because religion was infrastructure, just like the temples themselves. It organized time through festival calendars. It justified laws by claiming divine origin. It explained suffering and promised meaning. And whoever controlled the narrative, who the gods favored, what they demanded, how their will should be understood, controlled more than belief. They controlled behavior, loyalty, the very framework people use to make sense of existence. So the question lingers: if faith is personal and intimate, lived in kitchen corners and whispered at bedsides, can it ever truly be owned by institutions? Or does it always slip through official fingers, remaining stubbornly, dangerously, in the hands of the people who need it most? The offerings didn't vanish into the heavens, they moved through hands, ledgers, and kitchens like a second economy. Enter a major temple complex at dawn, when the gates open and the day's rhythm begins. This isn't a quiet, contemplative space. It's a living organism. Storehouses line the outer walls, their doorways guarded, their contents inventoried daily. Workshops hum with activity, weavers producing linen for priestly garments, metalworkers repairing ritual tools, bakers preparing sacred bread in quantities that smell nothing like devotion and everything like industrial production. Scribes sit in shaded alcoves, papyrus scrolls unfurling across their laps, tracking inputs and outputs with the precision of accountants. Guards watch the flow of goods entering and leaving, ensuring nothing disappears without record. Priests move through it all like conductors of a practiced tide, their white linen pristine despite the dust and bustle surrounding them. The temple owns land, not symbolically, legally. Vast estates worked by farmers who owe labor, taxes, or both. Grain flows in from these holdings, measured in quantities that dwarf household storage. Livestock arrives: cattle, geese, ducks destined for slaughter and offering. Oil, wine, incense, precious materials all funnel toward the temple because the gods require feeding. And feeding gods at this scale requires infrastructure most kingdoms would envy. But here's where the system reveals its dual nature. Offerings are presented to divine statues in inner sanctums closed to everyone except high priests. Bread is laid before stone faces, beer is poured, meat is burned, the smoke rising as if carried to distant realms. The ritual happens, sacred and formal, exactly as prescribed. Then the offerings are removed, because gods, being immortal and non-corporeal, don't actually consume physical food. So what happens to it? It feeds the priests, their families, temple workers, officials. The bread offered to Amun in the morning becomes lunch for the scribes tracking temple accounts. The beer poured for Ra gets distributed to laborers maintaining the complex. The meat presented to Pitar ends up in stews served to guards and administrators. Sacred food becomes practical sustenance through a process so routine it barely registers as transition. The divine blesses it, humans consume it, everyone benefits. This isn't fraud. It's system design. The theology explicitly allows it once offered. The food retains divine essence but no longer requires physical presence before the god. It's been sanctified, which actually increases its value. Eating temple offerings isn't theft. It's participation in divine generosity. A closed loop where devotion produces material support, and material support enables devotion. Temples shape lives beyond feeding workers. They control access to resources entire communities depend on. A farmer whose land borders temple estates might receive seed during shortages at a price, or with obligations attached. A craftsman might find work in temple workshops when other employment dries up. A family facing crisis might petition for aid from temple storehouses, and sometimes they receive it, creating debts of gratitude that translate into loyalty, labor, future offerings. The line between holy and ordinary was porous by design. Divine order wasn't just cosmic theology, it was social management. Keep people invested in the system's stability, and they'll defend it. Give them reasons to believe the gods care about their survival, and they'll care about the gods in return. The offerings cycling through temples created a tangible link between heaven and earth, between abstract belief and full stomachs. Was this care or control? Both, probably. The priests who managed these systems likely believed they were serving divine will while also understanding the practical necessities. The workers who received temple rations likely felt genuine gratitude, while also recognizing they were caught in dependencies that limited choices. The state that relied on temples to organize and stabilize communities likely saw religion as essential infrastructure while also wielding it as leverage. But beneath this already complex system, another layer existed, stranger, more industrial, operating at a scale that transformed devotion into something almost unrecognizable. A practice that took the impulse to honor the divine and multiplied it until innocence became industry, until sacred spaces filled with millions upon millions of small bodies, each one a prayer wrapped in linen, each one proof that when humans systematize belief, the results can be both magnificent and deeply, quietly unsettling. A prayer wrapped in linen. But what if the bundle wasn't what it claimed to be? Imagine a pilgrim approaching a temple, dust on their sandals from a long walk, hope tight in their chest. They've come to ask for something: health for a sick child, safety for a husband traveling dangerous routes, forgiveness for a mistake that weighs too heavy to carry alone. The priests offer a solution: present an offering to the god, something living transformed into something eternal, a messenger that will carry your prayer into the afterlife where divine ears are more likely to listen. The pilgrim pays. Not much, but enough that it matters. In return, they receive a small wrapped bundle, palm-sized, surprisingly light. Linen binds it carefully, strips wound with the same reverence used for human dead. Inside, they're told, is a sacred animal: an ibis for Thoth, a cat for Bastet, a falcon for Horus. The creature was raised in temple precincts, fed and cared for, then ritually killed and mummified, so it could serve as a bridge between mortal desperation and divine mercy. The pilgrim carries it to the offering chamber, places it with thousands of others, whispers their prayer, and leaves feeling lighter. The gods have received their message. Something has been done. This happened millions of times. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. Archaeologists have uncovered catacombs packed floor to ceiling, with mummified animals, ibises stacked like cordwood, cats arranged in rows, bulls in individual chambers, crocodiles, dogs, snakes, fish, shrews. The sheer scale is staggering. One site alone held over 4 million ibis mummies. Another contained hundreds of thousands of cats. The numbers suggest an industry, not individual acts of devotion. And it was an industry. Workshops specialized in animal mummification, operating with assembly line efficiency. Breeders raised birds and cats specifically for this purpose, born sacred, destined to die young, their brief lives existing solely to become offerings. Supply chains coordinated deliveries to temples across Egypt. Priests managed inventories, tracking demand during festival seasons when pilgrims arrived in waves. Traders profited, taking cuts at every step between breeder and burial. Faith became commerce. Devotion became production. The impulse was genuine. People truly believed these offerings mattered, that their prayers needed physical form to reach divine attention. But the system that met that need operated on scales that had more to do with profit than piety. And here's where the ground shifts beneath the tender image. Not every bundle contained what the buyer imagined. Modern scanning technology reveals inconsistencies that would have shattered a pilgrim's heart. Some mummies were carefully prepared, complete animals wrapped with skill and respect. Others contained partial remains, a single bone, a fragment of feather. Some held multiple species jumbled together. Some were padded with reeds or mud, shaped to feel right but empty of the sacred creature promised. Some contained nothing at all except linen wrapped around air and hope. Was this fraud? Probably. Sometimes. A workshop cutting corners, priests prioritizing volume over authenticity, traders selling belief without delivering substance. But it's also possible the theology evolved to accommodate reality. Maybe the symbolic act mattered more than literal contents. Maybe the gods cared about intention rather than biological accuracy. Maybe buyers suspected but chose not to know, because the ritual itself provided comfort whether or not an actual cat lay beneath the wrappings. The pattern is human. People want tangible hope. They want to hold something that represents their prayers, to perform an action that feels like agency when life feels chaotic and cruel. Institutions recognize that need and meet it, creating systems that deliver comfort at scale. Sometimes those systems maintain integrity. Sometimes they cut corners. Often they exist in the space between, serving genuine needs while also serving themselves. But if faith shaped bodies in death, wrapping them, preserving them, transforming them into vessels for prayers and divine communication, what did Egyptians do to bodies in life? When illness struck, when pain wouldn't stop, when the vulnerabilities of flesh became undeniable, how did they respond? With prayer, yes, but also with observation, experimentation, treatments that blurred the line between ritual and medicine. Because beneath the myth and mystery, beneath the gods and temples, ancient Egypt also developed something quieter and more empirical. A practical understanding of the living body, its failures, and the fragile, persistent human effort to heal what breaks. Egypt promised eternity, yet most people lived with aching teeth, scars, and questions that had no visible answers. Follow the body through an ordinary day. Dawn arrives and lungs fill with air that tastes of dust, sand blown from the desert, chaff from threshing floors, smoke from cooking fires that never quite clear. The sun touches skin and stays there. Relentless. Aging faces faster than time alone would manage. By midday, muscles strain under loads they've carried 1,000 times before: grain sacks, water jars, limestone blocks, and the body remembers each repetition in joints that protest a little more each year. Teeth meet bread. Not the soft kind from modern ovens, but dense loaves made from flour ground between stones. Stones that shed grit into every batch no matter how careful the miller. That grit works like sandpaper, wearing enamel down to roots, exposing nerves, creating pain that throbs with each bite. By middle age, teeth are ground flat or broken. Abscesses common enough to be expected rather than exceptional. Skeletons tell this story clearly. Jaws showing infections, missing teeth, evidence of suffering that had to be endured because there was no alternative. The diet was simple, repetitive, nutritious enough to sustain but rarely varied. Bread and beer formed the foundation, carbohydrates and fermented grain that provided calories and safety from contaminated water. Onions, garlic, lentils when available. Fish from the Nile, dried or fresh, depending on proximity to the river and season. Meat rarely, reserved for festivals or the tables of those who could afford regular slaughter. Vegetables grown in small plots. Fruit when the harvest allowed. It kept people alive, kept them working, but it didn't spare them from the accumulated damage of living. Injuries came with the work. Backs compressed from carrying weight year after year. Fingers crushed in construction accidents. Burns from cooking fires and smithing forges. Cuts that healed badly or didn't heal at all, turning septic in a world without antibiotics. Broken bones that set crooked because the knowledge existed to splint them, but not always to align them perfectly. Occupational hazards written into skeletons' spines showing the distinctive wear of people who bent and lifted, shoulders damaged by repetitive overhead motion, knees worn from kneeling on stone. Yet ancient does not mean ignorant. It means improvising with what exists. People observed patterns. They noticed that certain herbs reduced fever, that honey kept wounds from festering, that willow bark eased pain. They developed techniques setting fractures, stitching wounds, even performing surgery when necessary. They understood anatomy well enough from butchering animals and preparing bodies for burial. They knew the heart pumped, that vessels carried something vital, that the brain controlled movement even if they couldn't explain the mechanisms. Health was communal because it had to be. Families cared for the ill, bathing them, feeding them, sitting through fevers that might break or might not. Neighbors shared remedies passed down through generations, recipes and rituals that someone's grandmother swore worked. Midwives attended births, bringing experience that meant the difference between survival and tragedy. Healers emerged in communities, people whose treatment seemed more successful than others, who accumulated knowledge through practice and became resources everyone relied on. But here's where the suspense builds. How did people explain pain when they couldn't see its cause? A visible wound made sense: cut skin, insert treatment, hope for healing. But internal pain, the kind that came from nowhere and stayed, the illnesses that weakened without obvious injury, the fevers that burned without fire, those demanded explanations that observation alone couldn't provide. So, they created frameworks that blended what they could see with what they had to imagine. Practical treatments and spiritual protection sat in the same palm, offered by the same healers, because the line between physical and supernatural causes was never clear. Maybe the infection came from the wound. Maybe it came from an angry spirit. Maybe both were true, and treatment required addressing both: cleaning the injury and reciting the protective spell, applying the herb and invoking the God who governed healing. This wasn't superstition replacing knowledge. It was knowledge working within a different framework, one where the visible and invisible were equally real, where healers had to be part physician, part priest, part practical experimenter willing to try what worked even when they couldn't explain why. Their cures could be startlingly practical until, in the same breath, they invoked forces no one could measure. Picture a healer entering a home where worry thickens the air. A man lies on a mat, his leg wrapped but the wrapping already stained, the smell wrong. The cut happened days ago, a slip while working stone, nothing that seemed serious at first. But the wound hasn't closed. Instead, it's opened wider, edges red and angry, heat radiating from flesh that should be healing. His family watches the healer's face for signs of hope or resignation, trying to read a future they can't control. The healer unwraps the wound slowly, examining what the fabric hid. The voice stays calm, practiced, because panic helps no one. Hands move with certainty, even when the outcome isn't certain at all. First, cleaning water boiled and cooled, because somehow they knew heat made water safer, even without understanding bacteria. Then honey, thick and golden, spread directly onto the infection, not because it's sweet, but because it works. Honey pulls moisture from wounds, creates an environment where infection struggles to spread. Modern medicine would later confirm what ancient observation already taught. Honey has antimicrobial properties, can promote healing, reduces inflammation. The healer applies a poultice next: ground herbs mixed into paste. Willow bark for pain, its active compound the same one aspirin would later synthesize. Garlic for its natural antibiotic qualities. Moldy bread sometimes, which sounds absurd until you remember penicillin comes from mold, that someone noticed bread left in certain conditions seemed to help wounds close. The bandaging is careful. Clean linen wrapped to protect without cutting off circulation. Changed regularly because leaving wounds sealed indefinitely invites worse problems. This is medicine. Observation turned into practice, trial and error across generations. Knowledge accumulated and passed down because it saved lives often enough to matter. But the healer doesn't stop there. While wrapping the wound, a spell is spoken, words asking Sekhmet, the goddess who sends disease, to withdraw her attention, or invoking Isis, whose magic healed her son Horus, to extend that protection here. The patient's name is used, making the spell specific, personal, directed. An amulet might be tied near the wound, a symbol meant to create spiritual barrier between flesh and whatever unseen forces cause suffering. This is also medicine. Psychological reassurance, when outcomes are uncertain, when even the best treatment might fail, when the patient needs to believe healing is possible in order to endure what comes next. The spell doesn't replace the honey, it accompanies it. Both matter. Both serve purposes the healer understands differently than we would, but no less seriously. Medical texts survive from ancient Egypt, written on papyrus that should have crumbled but didn't. They read like manuals. If you examine a man with a gaping wound in his head, reaching to the bone, you should stitch it and apply fresh meat on the first day. Practical, specific, based on experience. Other passages describe fractures, dislocations, how to distinguish injuries that can be treated from those that cannot. The language is clinical, the observations sharp. Then, in the same texts, spells appear. Incantations to be recited during treatment, rituals to perform alongside bandaging. The shift feels jarring to modern eyes, like watching someone measure ingredients precisely and then add a prayer as if it were another ingredient. But for Egyptian healers, both were ingredients. Physical and spiritual causes required physical and spiritual responses. The framework wasn't confused, it was comprehensive. Some treatments sound surprisingly sensible. Honey, herbs, splinting, surgery. Others feel alarming animal dung applied to wounds, remedies involving bodily fluids, ingredients chosen for symbolic rather than practical reasons. The discomfort of sitting with incomplete knowledge forces a question. Were they wrong? Or were they working with different information, different frameworks, arriving at conclusions that made sense within their understanding of how bodies and worlds functioned? And if bodies were this fragile, prone to infection, injury, decay, why did Egyptians become so extraordinarily skilled at preserving them after death? What drove the obsession with keeping flesh intact when life had already left? The answer requires following their hands into tombs, into processes that reveal what Egypt truly understood about the human form and what it was willing to do to defy time itself. To keep a body from vanishing, Egyptians had to understand it, so what else did they know that the myths never mention? The process began with a body still warm from death and a family's urgent need to stop what came next. Decay. The inevitable return to dust that every living thing faces. In Egypt's heat, decomposition moved fast, and if preservation was going to happen, it had to start immediately. Specialists arrived embalmers whose trade passed father to son, whose workshops sat on the edge of settlements where the smell wouldn't disturb the living. They carried knowledge that required intimacy with anatomy, with chemistry, with time and transformation. First, the organs. Not all of them, but most. The brain was removed through the nose using hooks, a procedure that sounds brutal but required precision to avoid damaging the skull's exterior. The chest and abdomen were opened with careful incisions. Liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. Each organ was extracted, treated, preserved separately in canopic jars that would accompany the body into burial. The heart stayed. It was considered the seat of thought, emotion, identity. Without it, the person couldn't be judged in the afterlife, couldn't speak their truth before divine assessors. The empty cavities were washed with palm wine, packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt that drew moisture from tissue like a slow, patient thief. The body was covered in natron, inside and out, and left to dry for 40 days. During that time, fluids leached away, skin tightened, the corpse transformed from flesh into something closer to leather. When the embalmers returned, they cleaned the body again, stuffed the cavities with linen or sawdust to restore shape, anointed the skin with oils and resins that smelled of eternity, and cost more than most families earned in months. Then came the wrapping. Hundreds of meters of linen, wound in patterns that held both practical and ritual significance. Amulets were placed between layers, scarabs over the heart, protective symbols near vulnerable points. Spells were recited, each layer another barrier against oblivion. The finished mummy barely resembled the person who died, yet it preserved their form, their identity, the physical anchor their soul would need to return to. This was elite mummification, expensive, elaborate, reserved for those who could afford specialists, materials, time. But the impulse to preserve wasn't exclusive to wealth. Ordinary families wanted it too, the hope that death wasn't total erasure, that their loved ones could continue in some form. So simpler methods existed, bodies wrapped without full evisceration, natural desiccation in the desert sand, which sometimes preserved better than expensive techniques. Minimal ritual, maximum practicality. The afterlife had tears, and access correlated with resources. The anxiety driving all of it was universal, the fear of vanishing completely. In Egyptian theology, existence required the body, the name, the memory. Lose any piece, and the person dissolved into non-being, a fate worse than any underworld punishment. Mummification was insurance against that terror. It kept the body whole so the soul had somewhere to return. It created a physical anchor for identity in a cosmos where identity could be lost. But creating eternity required labor. Embalmers, yes, but also linen weavers producing the wrappings, resin traders importing materials from distant lands, canopic jar makers, amulet crafters, priests overseeing rituals, tomb builders preparing the final resting place. An entire economy orbited death, and families paid into it because the alternative, watching someone they loved disappear entirely, was unbearable. The tombs that survive glorify nobles, officials, royalty. Their burials were theatrical productions, their preservation meticulous, their afterlives furnished with everything wealth could buy. But the vast majority faced death with fewer resources and the same fear. They were mummified poorly or not at all. They were buried in simple graves that time and grave robbers emptied. Their names, if recorded, were lost. The erased everyday extended into death, where inequality followed people beyond their last breath. Yet even among the forgotten, some left marks not in tombs, but in courts. Because when fear and scarcity intensified, when desperation outweighed risk, people turned to crime. And Egypt's legal system, meticulous and unforgiving, recorded those moments line by line, preserving confessions and judgments that reveal a different kind of immortality. The immortality of transgression, written down by scribes who never imagined anyone would care about common criminals 3,000 years later. In a land obsessed with order, even a missing donkey could become a recorded drama with witnesses, accusations, and consequences. The hearing takes place in the heat of midday, shades scarce, tempers already thin before anyone speaks. A crowd gathers because disputes are public, and everyone knows that justice, or the appearance of it, requires witnesses. The scribe sits with papyrus ready, reed pen poised, face neutral in a way that suggests he's heard all of this before. Two men stand before the local magistrate, each claiming ownership of the same animal, each insisting the other is a liar, a thief, someone whose word cannot be trusted. This is Egyptian law at ground level. Not grand proclamations carved in stone, but the messy reality of people living too close together with too few resources and too many opportunities for conflict. The donkey matters because it represents labor, transport, survival. Losing it means lost income, lost capability, a slide toward desperation that everyone present understands intimately. The magistrate listens. Witnesses are called neighbors who saw the animal yesterday, a merchant who remembers which man bought grain using a donkey matching this description, a child who can't be intimidated into changing their story. The scribe records it all, every claim and counterclaim, creating a permanent account of a dispute that will be forgotten within a generation, but preserved for millennia because someone thought documentation mattered more than papyrus cost. Order ma'at wasn't just a philosophical concept in ancient Egypt. It was a social demand, a pressure everyone felt to maintain balance, truth, fairness. The opposite of ma'at was chaos, and chaos threatened everything: harvests, floods, the stability that kept the kingdom functioning. So disputes had to be resolved, not left to fester. Theft had to be punished, not ignored. Lies had to be challenged, not accepted. The system existed to reinforce the idea that actions had consequences, that society operated on principles that transcended individual desire. But enforcement was uneven. Who could speak confidently in these settings? Those who knew how to present themselves, how to frame arguments in language magistrates respected. The poor, the illiterate, those without patrons, they faced disadvantages that the scribe's neutral record never quite captured. A wealthy man, accused of boundary theft, could bring witnesses who owed him favors. A widow arguing over unpaid labor might struggle to find anyone willing to testify against her late husband's former employer. The cases that filled local courts sound startlingly familiar. Stolen goods, not treasures, but tools, fabric, grain, things people needed immediately and couldn't afford to replace. Boundary arguments where neighbors disputed land edges, each claiming the other had moved markers or plowed too far into shared territory. Unpaid labor, where workers demanded compensation and employers claimed the work was substandard or incomplete. Family conflicts, inheritance disputes that turned siblings into enemies, divorce proceedings where property division became warfare, custody questions about children caught between separated parents. These weren't abstractions. They were daily friction made formal. The kind of conflicts that arise when people are pressed together by necessity and survival depends on knowing where your rights end and another's begin. The records preserve frustration, desperation, small betrayals that felt enormous to those involved. A man accusing his brother of stealing seed meant for planting. A woman demanding return of a loan her neighbor denies ever receiving. A craftsman suing an apprentice who left before completing contracted work. The scribe wrote it all down, creating archives that weren't meant to inspire anyone but to track resolutions, to establish precedent, to prove that the system functioned even when individual outcomes felt unjust. But if these small crimes, missing donkeys, disputed boundaries, unpaid debts filled courts and scrolls, what happened when the crime struck at something far more sacred? When desperation or greed turned toward the tombs themselves, those eternal houses filled with everything wealth could buy and death couldn't protect. When the taboo against disturbing the dead collided with the reality that tombs were warehouses of treasure, guarded only by belief and whatever physical barriers could be built, that's where the true test of Ma'at revealed itself. Because tomb robbery wasn't just theft, it was assault on eternity, violation of the cosmic contract that promised the dead would rest undisturbed. And yet it happened. Frequently. Systematically. With participation from the very people tasked with preventing it. The dead were supposed to be untouchable, so why do we have confessions that read like an ancient heist? The investigation begins with a report. Tombs have been opened, not by time or accident, but by hands that knew what they were looking for. Seals broken, corridors violated, chambers that should have remained dark for eternity now exposed to torchlight that was never meant to enter. The officials arrive, and the questioning starts methodical, relentless, designed to extract truth from people who know that confession means punishment, but silence might mean worse. The confessions that survive read with eerie intimacy. A man describes entering through a tunnel dug from an adjacent tomb. The route planned over weeks, the weak point identified by someone who understood construction. He talks about the moment the seal broke, the sound it made, the hesitation before stepping into space reserved for the dead. He lists what was taken: gold jewelry first, small and valuable, oils and perfumes, worth their weight in precious metals, linen wrappings, which could be sold or reused. He mentions prying open the mummy itself, searching for amulets hidden between layers, tearing through what was meant to be eternal to reach what could be spent today. Another confession details coordination. Multiple men, each with a role. One stands watch, another breaks through walls. A third carries goods out under cover of darkness. They divide the spoils later, in a house far from the necropolis, weighing gold and arguing over shares like merchants settling accounts. The crime wasn't impulsive desperation, it was organized, planned, executed with the efficiency of people who'd done it before. And they had done it before. Because tomb robbery wasn't rare. It spiked during periods when the state faltered, when rations ran short, when wages went unpaid, and hunger sharpened into something more dangerous than fear of divine punishment. The dead had wealth. The living had need. The equation was simple, even if the moral weight was crushing. Communities whispered. Everyone knew, or suspected, or chose not to ask questions that might implicate neighbors or family. A man suddenly has resources he didn't have before. Where did they come from? A merchant deals in goods that look suspiciously like burial equipment. Who's asking where he acquired them? Silence became complicity. And complicity spread until whole networks operated with the understanding that no one would speak unless forced. The investigators used tools we'd recognize: interrogation, cross-examination, physical evidence, witness testimony. But they also used torture when persuasion failed, beating confessions from suspects whose bodies were already showing signs of labor and malnutrition. The records don't hide this. They document it matter-of-factly, as if pain were just another tool for discovering truth. And here's where the ground shifts completely. Some records suggest the system was compromised from within. Guards who were supposed to patrol the necropolis appear in confessions as participants, taking cuts in exchange for looking away or providing information. Officials who should have investigated show up as beneficiaries, selling stolen goods through intermediaries or using their positions to protect robbers in exchange for shares. Priests, temple workers, the very people tasked with maintaining sacred boundaries, some of them violated those boundaries for profit. The heists required inside knowledge. Which tombs held the most wealth? Which had weak defenses? When patrols changed, where tunnels could be dug without detection? That information came from people who worked in or around the necropolis, people who were supposed to be guardians but became guides for thieves instead. The moral unease hangs heavy. If even the dead were not safe, if tombs built to last forever could be emptied within a generation, if the people sworn to protect them were the ones leading robbers inside, what did that say about the living? About the promises Egypt made and couldn't keep? About Ma'at, divine order, the entire structure that claimed cosmic backing but crumbled when hunger and greed pressed hard enough? It said that Egypt, for all its monuments and eternal promises, was human, fallible, compromised by the same forces that pressure every society: inequality, desperation, corruption. And it said something else, something the temples never wanted to admit. Egypt wasn't isolated, wasn't pure, wasn't the unchanging civilization its propaganda claimed. It was connected to trade routes, to foreign powers, to influences that moved across borders and mixed with local traditions, until the line between Egyptian and outsider became harder to draw than the stone carvings suggested. Egypt's borders looked firm in stone, yet the real Egypt breathed in foreign words, foreign gods, and foreign blood. The Nile flows north, but goods flow in every direction. Cedar from Lebanon arrives in long ships, timber too valuable to grow locally, essential for building anything that needs to last beyond mud brick. Copper from Sinai and Cyprus, smelted and shaped into tools that cut stone and harvest grain. Tin from distant sources, combined with copper to make bronze harder, sharper, more durable. Oils and resins from Punt, frankincense and myrrh that make temples smell like divinity. Wine from the Mediterranean coast, better than anything Egyptian vineyards produce. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, a blue so deep it becomes the color of night sky in tomb paintings, traveling thousands of miles through dozens of hands before reaching an Egyptian craftsman's workshop. These aren't just objects, they're connections. Every trade route is a conversation. Every merchant is a carrier of more than goods. They bring languages, stories, techniques, ideas that don't stop at Egypt's borders just because the monuments pretend they should. Traders settle in port cities, learning enough Egyptian to negotiate but keeping their own languages for home and prayer. Interpreters become essential. People who can move between worlds, who understand that commerce requires translation not just of words but of customs, expectations, the unspoken rules that make deals succeed or fail. They marry locally sometimes, their children growing up speaking multiple tongues, belonging fully to neither culture and partly to both. Mercenaries arrive when Egypt needs soldiers, foreign warriors hired for campaigns, for garrison duty, for skills Egyptian armies lack. Nubians, Libyans, Greeks, people from the Levant and beyond, they fight for pay, for land grants, for the promise of security in a kingdom that's not theirs by birth but becomes theirs through service. Some stay, some have children who know no other home. Their names appear in records, their burial customs mix Egyptian practices with traditions carried from elsewhere. Migrants come for work, for opportunity, for escape from drought or conflict in their homelands. They settle in border regions first, then drift inland, filling labor needs, bringing skills. A potter from Syria teaches techniques that Egyptian craftsmen adopt. A musician from Libya introduces instruments and rhythms that blend into local traditions until no one remembers they were foreign. A priestess from Nubia serves in a temple to gods who existed before Egypt claimed them, her rituals preserving something older than the dynasties. The evidence sits in tombs that don't match purely Egyptian styles, in names that clearly derive from other languages, in artistic motifs borrowed from Minoan Crete or Mesopotamian cylinder seals, in religious practices that honor foreign deities alongside Egyptian ones, creating syncretism where Baal becomes Seth, where Astarte joins the pantheon, where the boundaries between Egyptian and outsider blur until the categories lose meaning. Egypt was never isolated. The fantasy of the sealed kingdom, pure and unchanging, exists only in propaganda meant to project eternal stability. The reality was constant conversation, sometimes peaceful trade, sometimes violent conquest, often something between. Goods, people, and ideas moved across borders that were administratively real but culturally porous. And here's the pattern that emerges. When foreign influences increase, when the kingdom feels less purely Egyptian than the temples claim, elites often tighten the official story. They emphasize ma'at, divine order, the cosmic rightness of Egyptian ways. They commission art showing foreigners as defeated enemies, even when those same foreigners live peacefully within Egypt's borders, contributing to its economy, marrying into its families. They reinforce narratives of purity precisely when purity is most obviously a fiction. Because instability and interconnection rise together. Trade brings wealth, but also dependency. When Lebanon stops exporting cedar, Egyptian building projects halt. Foreign mercenaries bring military strength, but also political complications. What happens when they demand more than wages? When they seize power? When the army that's supposed to defend Egypt is composed largely of people Egypt's official ideology treats as inferior? The answer, preserved in the gaps and contradictions the monuments couldn't erase, is that outsiders didn't just visit Egypt or threaten it from outside. They lived within its borders. They worked, worshipped, raised families, died, and were buried in Egyptian soil. Some rose to positions of influence that later histories preferred to forget, and some, in moments when Egypt's power fractured and the official story couldn't hold, ruled it entirely. If Egypt was so confident in itself, why did it need to keep declaring who belonged? The borderlands weren't lines drawn on maps. They were living spaces where cultures bled into each other through daily contact, where the distinction between Egyptian and outsider became negotiable, practical, something people navigated rather than something that defined them absolutely. To the south, Nubia sometimes enemy, sometimes trading partner, sometimes vassal, sometimes conqueror. Relations shifted with political winds, but people kept crossing the border regardless, carrying goods, skills, families, and gods that didn't recognize political boundaries. To the northeast, the Levant Syrian cities, Canaanite settlements, pathways that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia and beyond. Soldiers moved along these routes, hired for campaigns that required more bodies than Egypt could supply from its own population. Craftsmen followed opportunity. Their specialized skills, metalworking, glassmaking, techniques Egypt valued but hadn't developed independently, making them welcome despite their foreign origins. Families fled hardship, drought, conflict, instability that made Egypt's relative order attractive even if it meant living as outsiders in someone else's kingdom. The deserts that surrounded Egypt weren't walls. They were highways for those who knew them. Oasis routes carried trade and travelers. Bedouin groups moved through spaces Egyptian officials barely controlled, their knowledge of desert survival making them valuable as guides, guards, intermediaries. The Red Sea coast connected to distant ports, bringing goods and people from Arabia, the Horn of Africa, even India through networks that predated Egyptian dynasties. Evidence of blending appears in subtle forms. Loanwords pepper Egyptian texts, technical terms for foreign goods, names for plants and animals that came from elsewhere, vocabulary that reveals contact too frequent and intimate to avoid linguistic mixing. Artifacts show hybrid styles, pottery combining Egyptian shapes with foreign decoration, jewelry using techniques learned from immigrant craftsmen, weapons designed by mercenaries and adopted by Egyptian armies. Burial customs reveal the deepest mixing. A tomb in a border town contains a body positioned in Egyptian style but with grave goods that speak to Syrian origins. Another holds amulets honoring both Egyptian and Canaanite deities, the deceased hedging bets or simply acknowledging that divine protection might come from multiple sources. Names shift across generations. Foreign names given Egyptian spellings. Egyptian names adopted by immigrant families trying to ease their children's integration. Foreign was often a category imposed by power, not a clear lived reality. Officials needed to sort people for taxation, labor conscription, military service. They created classifications that real life constantly complicated. A man born in Nubia, who served in the Egyptian army for 20 years, who married an Egyptian woman, who worshipped Egyptian gods alongside his ancestral ones, was he foreign? His children, born in Egypt, speaking Egyptian as their first language, were they? The administrative answer might be yes. The lived experience was messier. Identity could be negotiated. Names changed to sound more Egyptian, easing interactions with officials who distrusted outsiders. Clothing adapted immigrants wearing Egyptian linen in public, traditional garments at home. Worship blended foreign gods were given Egyptian attributes. Egyptian gods were honored with foreign rituals. And syncretism became so common that tracking which deity originated where required scholarship most people didn't care about. Yet officials kept trying to sort people into tidy boxes. Temple inscriptions listed foreigners as defeated enemies even when those same people lived peacefully within Egypt, contributing to its economy. Royal propaganda emphasized Egyptian superiority, divine favor, cosmic rightness declarations that felt necessary precisely because the reality was more complicated. If Egypt's identity was secure and obvious, why the constant need to declare it, to reinforce it, to distinguish Egyptian from non-Egyptian through repeated insistence? Because the boundaries were porous, because people crossed them constantly, because Egypt's strength came partly from its ability to absorb influences, adopt useful practices, integrate outsiders who brought skills and knowledge the kingdom needed. But that absorption threatened the official story of eternal, unchanging, purely Egyptian civilization, ruled by divine kings whose authority derived from cosmic order. And sometimes in moments that later histories tried to minimize or erase, the outsiders didn't just live in Egypt or contribute to its economy. They held its throne. They ruled as pharaohs. They commanded armies, built monuments, issued decrees, and claimed the same divine mandate that supposedly belonged only to those of pure Egyptian blood. Egypt's crown was supposed to be destiny, so how did outsiders wear it and still claim the gods were on their side? Egyptian kingship wasn't just political authority, it was cosmic function. The pharaoh maintained Ma'at, cosmic order, standing between chaos and creation as the living embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris, chosen by the gods before birth. The crown carried divine weight. The symbols, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail, the false beard, the Uraeus serpent on the brow weren't decorative. They were proof of legitimacy, visual declarations that this person, and only this person, held the right to rule. So when the throne passed to someone who wasn't born into Egyptian royalty, who didn't carry the bloodline the theology demanded, who came from groups the official propaganda had spent centuries depicting as inferior enemies. How did they make it work? They adopted the symbols completely, precisely, with the kind of thoroughness that suggests they understood the performance mattered more than the truth behind it. Foreign rulers commissioned art showing themselves in traditional Egyptian regalia. They took throne names written in hieroglyphs that emphasized their connection to Egyptian gods. They built temples, sponsored festivals, maintained the rituals that kept cosmic order supposedly intact. They became pharaohs not by changing what pharaoh meant, but by inhabiting the role so convincingly that resistance became harder to justify. The Hyksos ruled northern Egypt for over a century. Their origins in the Levant, clear from names, burial customs, and military technology they brought with them. Yet they styled themselves as legitimate pharaohs, used Egyptian administrative systems, and governed with enough stability that cities thrived under their control. Later, Egyptian histories called them invaders, catastrophes, interruptions of divine order. But the archaeological record shows functioning government, trade networks that flourished, cultural production that continued. Nubian kings conquered Egypt and ruled as the 25th dynasty. Their skin depicted darker in art, their origins undeniable. Yet they claimed to be restoring true Egyptian values, purifying religion, returning to traditions they argued current Egyptian rulers had corrupted. They built pyramids smaller than the Old Kingdom monuments, but pyramids nonetheless positioning themselves as more authentically Egyptian than the Egyptians they'd displaced. The propaganda worked well enough that their rule lasted decades, and their legitimacy wasn't seriously challenged until Assyrian invasion forced them south. This is psychological drama disguised as political history. A civilization built on the idea of eternal, divinely ordained continuity had to explain change without admitting vulnerability. The solution was adaptation propaganda that bent to accommodate new realities while maintaining the appearance of unchanging truth. Art styles shifted to emphasize the foreign ruler's Egyptian qualities. Titles were carefully chosen to invoke traditional authority. Ancestry was curated, sometimes invented, to create connections to previous dynasties that made the transition feel inevitable rather than disruptive. What gets erased in this process isn't always the foreign rulers themselves. Sometimes they're acknowledged, even celebrated, when their reigns prove successful. What gets erased is the acknowledgement that their foreignness ever mattered, that the divine mandate could transfer to people the system claimed were fundamentally unsuited for it. The theology had to be maintained even when reality contradicted it. So the contradiction was smoothed over, reframed, rewritten, until the story made sense again. Later histories did the heavier erasure. The Hyksos period became a shameful interruption, a time of chaos that right-thinking Egyptians should forget. Nubian pharaohs were minimized, their accomplishments downplayed, their legitimate rule repositioned as foreign occupation despite their careful maintenance of Egyptian traditions. The pattern repeats. When leadership changes in ways that threaten the official narrative, someone gets written out to preserve the illusion of continuity. But here's what the erasure couldn't fully hide. The throne passed to outsiders multiple times, and Egypt continued. Cities functioned, trade happened, temples were built. Life went on because political legitimacy, however important to elites and propaganda, mattered less to daily survival than the systems that kept people fed, the festivals that marked time, the neighborhoods where cultural blending happened so gradually, no one could point to the moment Egyptian became something else. And it's in those neighborhoods, in the food people ate, and the languages they mixed, and the ordinary habits that no propaganda controlled, that the real story of Egypt's complexity reveals itself most clearly. The official Egypt claimed it never changed, yet the everyday Egypt was always becoming something new. Step into a marketplace in any Egyptian city during the New Kingdom, and the first thing that strikes you isn't Egyptian at all, it's the smell. Cinnamon from distant coasts, a warmth that doesn't grow along the Nile, cardamom, pungent and sharp, traveling trade routes that cross deserts and seas. Black pepper worth more than most workers earn in a week, reserved for tables that can afford extravagance. These spices didn't just flavor food, they marked status, created desire, changed what Egyptian cooking meant as generations grew up expecting tastes their ancestors never knew. Textiles tell the same story. Syrian dyes producing colors. Egyptian plants couldn't match purples so deep they became associated with royalty. Blues that made linen shimmer like water. Weaving techniques imported by immigrant craftsmen, patterns that Egyptian weavers watched, learned, and eventually claimed as their own innovations. A woman wearing a shawl in a neighborhood market might not know its design originated in Anatolia 3 generations back. It's just what people wear now. It's Egyptian because it's here, because it's hers, because origin stories matter less than present use. Amulets multiplied in variety as protective symbols crossed borders. The Egyptian scarab remains popular, but it's joined by Phoenician motifs, Mesopotamian demon wards, Syrian goddess figures. People hedged their bets, wearing protection from multiple traditions because when your child is sick or your harvest is failing, you use whatever might work. The priests might disapprove of mixing pantheons, but the priests aren't the ones watching fever burn through a family. Music absorbed everything. A lyre design from the Levant appears in tomb paintings, played by Egyptian musicians who've made it their instrument. Rhythms from Nubian ceremonies blend into festival performances until no one can trace which beats came from where. Songs adopt foreign words for concepts that didn't exist in Egyptian. Before contact made them necessary words for new instruments, new dances, new ways of celebrating that feel traditional even though they're recent imports. This is how culture actually changes. Not through official decree or royal mandate, but through ordinary people adopting what works, what appeals, what makes life easier or more beautiful or more bearable. A merchant tries a foreign cooking method and likes the results. A mother buys an amulet because her neighbor swears it helped. A musician hears a melody and remembers it, plays it later with variations, teaches it to students who'll teach it to others until it's simply Egyptian music and the foreign origin is forgotten. Yet elites promoted a timeless Egypt. Temple inscriptions declared eternal traditions unchanged since creation. Royal propaganda emphasized continuity, divine order, the certainty that Egyptian ways were cosmically correct and foreign influences were corruptions to be resisted. The gap between this official certainty and lived reality was enormous, and it grew wider with each generation, because the lived Egypt kept absorbing, adapting, changing. The bread was still bread, but the spices in it came from somewhere else. The linen was still linen, but the patterns were borrowed. The gods were still the gods, but their worship incorporated practices that would have confused priests from centuries earlier. Nothing stayed pure except the propaganda claiming purity. And when pressures mounted, when climate shifted and harvests failed, when trade routes became contested and luxury goods stopped flowing, when political stability fractured and the systems holding everything together began to crack that gap between official story and daily reality became dangerous. Because the official story promised divine protection, eternal order, the guarantee that Egypt would endure. But the people living through shortages and instability and administrative collapse could see the promise wasn't holding. Egypt's most famous fall wasn't a single dramatic moment. It wasn't Rome burning or walls breached by invading armies. It was a slow unthreading, systems breaking down gradually, institutions losing authority piece by piece, records becoming desperate, then sparse, then stopping entirely as the apparatus that maintained them collapsed. And in those final records, in the administrative documents and letters and pleas that survived, the erasure becomes most visible not of individuals, but of hope, not of names, but of the future itself. The fall of a kingdom doesn't start with flames, it starts with a normal day that suddenly costs too much. The bread ration arrives late. Not dramatically late, just a day, maybe 2. Enough to notice, enough to worry. The explanation is reasonable. Delays in transport, administrative complications, nothing to panic about. But next month it happens again, and the month after that the ration is smaller. Still bread, still sustenance, but less than promised, less than needed, less than people have come to depend on for survival. Prices shift in the marketplace. A sack of grain that cost 2 debn of copper now costs 3. The merchant shrugs, supply is tight, demand is high. This is just how markets work. But wages haven't increased. The gap between what people earn and what they need to live widens incrementally. Each adjustment small enough to absorb until suddenly it's not, until families are making choices between food and lamp oil, between feeding everyone poorly or feeding some adequately. The Nile's behavior matters like fate because it is fate. Too low, and the fields don't flood properly. Irrigation becomes desperate improvisation. Crops struggle in soil that's too dry and depleted. Harvests shrink. Grain reserves that should buffer the kingdom through lean years get tapped earlier, drained faster. Too high. And the flood destroys rather than nourishes. Homes wash away, storage facilities collapse, seed meant for planting dissolves in mud. Either extreme creates cascading failures that compound over seasons. Officials demand the same taxes from people who have less to give. The system wasn't designed for flexibility. Quotas were set assuming normal conditions. And normal hasn't happened in years. Collectors arrive with ledgers showing what's owed. Farmers try to explain that the harvest failed, that there's nothing to give. The collectors have their own pressures, their own supervisors demanding results. Negotiations happen, sometimes. Confiscations happen more often. Resentment accumulates like sediment. Trust thins. Not all at once, not with dramatic betrayals, but through small disappointments that accumulate until the assumption of reliability that institutions will function, that promises will be kept, that tomorrow will roughly resemble yesterday erodes. A worker who's always been paid on time isn't paid on time, then isn't paid at all. The excuse sounds plausible, but the pattern repeats. People start hoarding when they can, trading favors instead of relying on official channels, preparing for disruptions they hope won't come, but increasingly expect will. Civilizations rarely notice the end while living through it. There's no announcement, no clear moment when stability becomes collapse. People simply feel that life is getting harder to hold together. The margins for error shrink. The buffer between manageable and crisis disappears. What used to be solvable problems, a bad harvest, a delayed shipment, a personnel shortage, become catastrophic because there's no slack left in the system to absorb them. Ordinary households become the first alarm system. Less bread means children go hungry, which means they're weaker, more susceptible to illness, less able to work when they're old enough. Fewer offerings to household gods because the priority is feeding the living, not honoring the divine. More theft, not because morality collapsed, but because desperation makes people recalculate risks. A stolen loaf might mean punishment, but a hungry child is certain suffering now. The strain shows in records that become increasingly desperate. Letters pleading for overdue supplies. Complaints about officials who aren't doing their jobs. Accusations that someone, somewhere, is hoarding while others starve. The administrative apparatus still functions, still produces documents, but the documents reveal a system under pressure it wasn't built to handle. And the institutions meant to stabilize everything, temples wealthy enough to feed thousands, bureaucracies designed to coordinate resources across vast distances, begin competing rather than cooperating. Because when resources shrink, the question becomes who controls what remains. Temples own land, collect offerings, store grain that could feed communities or could be kept to ensure the institution's survival. Bureaucrats control distribution networks, decide who gets supplied first, who waits, who gets nothing. The goals diverge. Temple authorities want to maintain religious functions, keep festivals running, preserve the cosmic order their theology says prevents chaos. Administrative officials want to keep the state functioning, ensure the army gets fed, maintain enough stability to prevent outright revolt. Both claim to serve Egypt's interests. Both need resources the other controls. The cooperation that made the system work when abundance allowed generosity fractures, when scarcity forces choices. And in that fracture, as institutions fight over meaning and money, the gap between official certainty and lived reality becomes a chasm. Because the temples keep declaring divine favor, keep insisting Ma'at holds, keep performing rituals that promise the gods will provide. But the people receiving fewer rations, paying higher prices, watching their children suffer, they can see the promises aren't holding. The monuments still proclaim eternal Egypt. The streets know something is breaking. When the king's voice weakens, who speaks for the gods and who collects the grain? The balance was never equal, but it was functional. Kings held the symbols, the crown, the throne, the divine mandate that theoretically made their word absolute. They commanded armies, issued decrees, built monuments that proclaimed their eternal authority. Temples held something more tangible: land. Vast estates that produced grain, employed workers, controlled resources that could feed thousands or starve them depending on who made the decisions. For centuries, the arrangement worked through mutual dependency. Kings needed temples to legitimize their rule, to perform rituals that maintained cosmic order, to declare divine favor that made obedience seem spiritually necessary rather than politically enforced. Temples needed kings to grant land, protect property rights, ensure the stability that allowed religious institutions to accumulate wealth across generations. But when royal authority weakened, when succession crises created competing claimants, when military defeats undermined the pharaoh's image as divinely protected, when administrative collapse meant orders from the capital stopped being enforceable in distant provinces, the temples remained. Their land still produced, their granaries still held reserves, their priests still performed rituals that people believed mattered for survival. The symbols of kingship lost power when the king couldn't deliver security. The temples, holding actual resources, didn't. The contest that emerged was quiet, conducted through competing claims to legitimacy rather than open warfare. A pharaoh issues a decree. A high priest interprets divine will differently, and suddenly the decree conflicts with cosmic order. Who do local officials obey, the distant king whose authority is theoretical, or the nearby temple that controls their food supply and can claim the gods themselves object to royal overreach? Bureaucracy preserved itself even as the state weakened, because bureaucrats understood something essential: systems survive by being necessary. Scribes continued writing, tracking grain stores and tax obligations and legal disputes, creating the appearance of order even when actual control was fragmenting. Courts continued hearing cases because people still needed disputes resolved, and turning to traditional authorities felt safer than chaos. Officials continued demanding payments because extracting resources was how they justified their positions and fed their families. In some periods, the merger becomes visible. Spiritual leadership and political leadership collapse into the same office. High priests who control temple resources also govern provinces, collect taxes, command local militias. They maintain religious functions while performing administrative roles, blurring the line until priest and governor become interchangeable. The theocracy isn't declared, it just happens, gradually, as power flows toward whoever controls resources and can claim divine backing for their decisions. The palace still stands, the lamps still burn, officials still sit in chambers issuing proclamations. But walk those halls and the uncertainty is palpable. No one quite agrees who owns the room, whose authority is real, versus whose is performance maintained out of habit or hope that clarity will eventually return. Records from these periods become strange. Simultaneous dating systems appear, different authorities claiming the same year belongs to different rulers. Documents contradict each other about who holds titles, who controls territories, who has the right to make binding decisions. The administrative apparatus continues producing paperwork, but the paperwork reveals confusion about fundamental questions of authority that should have simple answers. Egypt doesn't collapse into silence. It fragments into competing voices, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling enough resources or territory to make the claim plausible within their sphere. The unified kingdom becomes a patchwork of local powers, some royal, some priestly, some military strongmen who stopped pretending divine mandate mattered more than force. And through it all, the official story, the one carved in stone, The one later ages would read and believe kept insisting on eternal, unchanging, divinely ordained Egypt. The chaos was smoothed over, repositioned as brief interruptions between periods of proper order, explained away as foreign invasions or divine tests rather than structural failures the system couldn't prevent, which raises a question that echoes forward through millennia. When the world later rediscovered Egypt, when archaeologists and scholars and treasure hunters arrived to decode hieroglyphs and excavate tombs and reconstruct history from fragments, what did they choose to see and what did they choose to ignore? Because the second life of Egypt, the one lived in museums and textbooks and popular imagination, created its own erasures. Different ones, modern ones, but erasures nonetheless, deciding which Egypt to remember and which to quietly leave buried. Egypt wasn't only edited by pharaohs, later ages edited it again, and the cuts are still visible. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt began with spectacle. 19th century excavators arrived with shovels, ambition, and audiences back home hungry for wonders. They found them golden masks gleaming in torchlight, royal tombs packed with treasures, hieroglyphs that seemed to whisper secrets across millennia. Newspapers printed breathless accounts. Museums competed for mummies and monuments. The public devoured stories of cursed pharaohs and lost civilizations, mystery wrapped in sand and prestige. But here's what received less attention. The pottery shards covered in grocery lists. The worn sandals discarded in workers' quarters. The tools used to carve the monuments, broken and replaced, and broken again. The letters complaining about late payments, the marriage contracts, the medical texts, the school exercises where children practiced writing by copying the same phrases until muscle memory took over. These artifacts explained far more about how Egypt actually functioned, how people lived, worked, loved, suffered, survived, but they didn't photograph as well. They didn't spark wonder. They were ordinary. And ordinary doesn't sell tickets to museum exhibitions or fund archaeological expeditions. Early excavators made choices about what to keep and what to discard. Choices driven partly by logistics. You can't ship everything back to European museums, but also by assumptions about what mattered. Royal objects mattered. Religious objects mattered. Gold mattered. The detritus of daily life, the fragments that revealed common existence, those often stayed in the sand or ended up in storage, where scholars might study them decades later, if ever. The hunger for spectacle shaped which sites received funding, which discoveries made headlines, which aspects of Egyptian civilization entered popular consciousness. A pharaoh's gold funerary mask becomes iconic, reproduced on posters and book covers, while the payroll records that prove workers were paid and organized and capable of striking remain obscure, known mainly to specialists who read academic journals most people never see. Modern obsession repeated ancient propaganda, often without realizing it. By centering kings and gods, by focusing on monuments and tombs, by treating the official story as the whole story, later ages amplified the erasure that began thousands of years earlier. The Egypt that emerged in museums and textbooks was the Egypt pharaohs wanted remembered: powerful, eternal, divine, mysterious. The everyday Egypt, the one that actually housed millions of lives across millennia, remained buried under preference for drama over documentation. This isn't conspiracy, it's pattern, human pattern. People gravitate toward what feels exceptional, what breaks the mundane, what promises access to something greater than ordinary existence. Curators display what visitors want to see. Publishers print what readers want to buy. Filmmakers create what audiences want to watch. And all of those wants were shaped by earlier presentations, earlier choices, earlier decisions about which Egypt deserved attention. The cuts are still visible if you know where to look. Museum displays that devote entire rooms to a single pharaoh's treasures while mentioning workers' villages in a single placard. Popular books that spend chapters on Cleopatra's romances, but paragraphs on the economic systems that fed her kingdom. Documentaries that linger on curses and mysteries while rushing past evidence of strikes, legal disputes, multicultural neighborhoods. The discomfort comes from recognizing complicity. We modern audiences, Casual museum visitors, consumers of Egyptian imagery, participate in the erasure by choosing which Egypt we engage with. We prefer the version that feels distant, exotic, safely removed from contemporary concerns. The version where kings were gods and mysteries remain unsolved, and the past stays romantic rather than relatable. But the everyday voices are still there, still waiting in plain sight, in the artifacts catalogued but not displayed, in the academic papers cited but not read, in the administrative documents that seemed too boring to translate until someone finally did and discovered that boring is where truth lives. Egypt was buried twice. Once by sand and time, natural processes that cover everything eventually, and once by selective attention, human processes that decide what deserves remembering and what can be forgotten. Both burials can be undone. Both require choosing to look beyond spectacle, to value the ordinary as highly as the exceptional, to understand that the people who built eternity also lived Tuesdays, and their Tuesdays, preserved in fragments we almost overlooked, tell stories the monuments never could. If both ancient rulers and modern collectors shaped what survives, then the Egypt they erased isn't a single conspiracy. It's a chain of choices, each link made by someone deciding what mattered. And chains can be traced, link by link, choice by choice, back to the voices that were always there, waiting for someone to listen. If you can choose what to place under a spotlight, you can choose what a civilization means. Walk through museum galleries and notice where the light falls. Spotlights illuminate golden coffins, their surfaces catching gleam and holding it like captured sunlight. Crowns rest under glass, each curve and symbol explained by labels that compress centuries into neat phrases. Symbol of divine authority. Funerary equipment of a high priest. New kingdom, dynasty Ichthint. The presentation is careful, reverent, designed to create wonder. Now notice what the shadows hold. Storage drawers in basement rooms, catalogued but rarely displayed. Pottery fragments with accounting marks. Broken tools. Children's toys worn smooth by hands that held them 3,000 years ago. Letters folded and sealed and never delivered. These exist in the same collections, preserved by the same institutions, but they don't get the spotlight. They don't anchor exhibitions or appear on promotional materials. They're available to researchers who request access, but most visitors will never see them. This is how discovery distorts. Not through deliberate deception, but through choices about presentation. Early excavations prioritized objects that would impress patrons funding the work treasures that justified expense and risk. Export laws evolved differently across decades and nations, sometimes allowing private collectors to claim artifacts that should have remained in Egypt, sometimes protecting cultural heritage too late to prevent significant losses. What left the country shaped what museums elsewhere could display, creating collections that reflected extraction as much as preservation. Private collections added another filter. Wealthy individuals bought what appealed to them, often spectacular pieces, royal items, objects with provenance connecting them to famous names. When those collections eventually entered museums, they brought their collectors' tastes with them. The everyday remained underrepresented because it was never purchased in the first place. Early interpretations also shaped understanding. Archaeologists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought their own assumptions about civilization, about race, about what constituted historical importance. Some saw Egypt through colonial lenses that emphasized exotic mystery over human complexity. Some dismissed evidence that contradicted prevailing theories. Some simply focused on what their training prepared them to notice, missing patterns that later scholarship would recognize as crucial. The most familiar Egypt, the one that lives in popular imagination, the one that appears in films and documentaries and coffee table books, is partly a product of what was easiest to display and most profitable to celebrate. Gold photographs beautifully. Mystery sells tickets. Kings and queens provide narrative hooks that everyday workers, no matter how essential, struggle to match. Yet this isn't only a story of distortion. It's also a story of preservation against enormous odds. Researchers who spent careers translating administrative texts no one else cared about. Local Egyptian workers who participated in excavations, whose knowledge of landscape and conditions proved essential, but whose names rarely appeared in publications. Curators who quietly prioritized comprehensive collecting over spectacular display, ensuring that mundane objects survived even if they didn't get spotlights. Scholars who recognized that papyrus fragments, covered in household accounts, deserved the same archival care as royal decrees. Recovery is human effort with human biases, which means it's incomplete and imperfect, but also ongoing. Each generation asks different questions of the same evidence. What earlier archaeologists ignored as unimportant, later scholars recognize as essential. Techniques improve imaging technology that can read text on papyrus too damaged to unfold, chemical analysis that reveals what people ate, DNA studies that trace movement and relationships. The work continues because the questions change, and changing questions illuminate different aspects of what's always been there. The mood here is hypnotic. Soft footsteps on polished museum floors, glass cases reflecting ceiling lights, quiet questions forming in spaces between the spotlights. What isn't here? What was found but not kept? What was kept but not shown? What stories wait in the objects we walk past without noticing because nothing about them sparkles? And here's the hopeful method that emerges from those questions. Read the margins. Follow the mundane objects. Pay attention to what was never meant to impress anyone, because that's where people left themselves most clearly, not in monuments designed for eternity, but in the disposable records of Tuesday. The shopping lists and work logs and complaint letters, the broken tools and worn sandals and cheap amulets, the graffiti and doodles and practice texts, the evidence that survived because it was too ordinary to destroy, too numerous to erase completely, too honest to perform for any audience beyond immediate necessity. When you shift focus from the spotlight to the shadows, the missing people begin to reappear. Not as anonymous crowds in the background of royal stories, but as individuals with names, occupations, families, problems, humor, grief, resilience. The Egypt they lived in wasn't the one the monuments describe. It was messier, more diverse, more complicated, more human, and the evidence for it has been there all along, waiting for someone to decide it deserves the same careful attention we've given to golden kings. The final, wait what? The most enduring part of Egypt may be the people history tried hardest not to notice. Return to the opening images. Towering gods stride across temple walls, their bodies impossibly perfect, their power absolute and eternal. Kings stand frozen in stone, arms raised in triumph, enemies crushed beneath their feet, divine right carved into every angle. The monuments speak in one voice, commanding, certain, designed to last forever and convince forever. But now overlay what's been recovered. A work crew sitting in protest, refusing to move until their rations arrive, their silence louder than any royal decree. A woman signing her name to a contract that protects her property, her authority preserved in ink that was never meant to impress the gods but worked anyway. A healer wrapping a wound with honey and spoken prayer, both given equal weight because survival required addressing body and spirit together. A family mourning someone whose tomb will never be found, whose name appears in no royal chronicle, but whose absence left a hole that letters and amulets tried desperately to fill. Migrants arriving with foreign names and unfamiliar gods, building lives in neighborhoods where Egyptian and outsider blurred until the categories stopped making sense. Thieves breaking into tombs not because they were evil, but because hunger and opportunity collided, and the dead, however sacred, couldn't fight back. Priests counting bread with the same meticulous attention they gave to cosmic rituals, because temples were machines of faith and economics simultaneously, and both required precise accounting. These aren't separate Egypts. They're the same place, the same time, the same civilization, one version carved in stone for eternity, the other scrawled on pottery and papyrus for Tuesday. Both are real, both are Egypt, but only one was meant to be remembered. And here's the last reveal. Philosophical and haunting, Egypt's greatest monument is not a pyramid, It's not a temple or a tomb or a statue that took decades to carve. It's the ordinary human insistence on meaning, repeated across millennia even when power tried to control the story. The shopping lists that tried to impose order on chaos. The marriage contracts that created certainty in relationships built on hope and risk. The amulets worn against invisible dangers. The jokes scratched into stone by people who knew their names would be forgotten, but needed to say, "I was here anyway." Every act of recording, even the mundane, especially the mundane, was an act of resistance against erasure. Every person who wrote their complaint, their recipe, their prayer, their tally marks, was insisting that their existence mattered enough to mark, that their Tuesday deserved preservation as much as any king's eternal triumph. Erasure, then, becomes both warning and invitation. What we remember is shaped by who is allowed to speak, what survives, and what we choose to value. The pharaohs chose stone and gold and monuments. They got remembered exactly as intended. But so did the workers who left graffiti, the mothers who wrote letters, the merchants who kept accounts, the healers who mixed remedies. They got remembered despite never intending immortality, because they left enough honest fragments that later eyes, if willing to look beyond spotlights, could piece together lives. The warning: history is always being written by someone, and that someone has motives. Question the spotlight. Ask what the shadows hold. Recognize that absence in the record doesn't prove absence in reality. It often proves the opposite. That someone or something was deliberately left out because including it would complicate the official story. The invitation: every fragment matters. Every ordinary object carries potential. The pottery shard you'd walk past in a museum case might be a voice waiting 3,000 years to be heard. The administrative document that seems boring might resurrect a person, a household, a community that the monuments never acknowledged. The work of recovery isn't finished. It never will be, because there are always more fragments, more patterns, more voices that earlier generations of scholars overlooked or undervalued. Somewhere, in a museum basement or an archaeological site not yet excavated, or a collection gathering dust in storage, another voice is still waiting, quiet, stubborn, real, written on a shard of pottery or a faded line of ink by someone who never imagined anyone would care, who was just trying to get through the day, who left a mark anyway because humans can't help but leave marks. The everyday was never meant to be immortal. The pyramids were, the temples were, the royal names carved in cartouches were designed to outlast time itself. Yet the everyday survived anyway in trash heaps and work camps, in letters no one kept and receipts no one valued, in the debris of ordinary life that proved harder to erase than anyone intended. And so the question that opened this story finally answers itself. If Egypt carved its history in stone, why does so much feel missing? Because the stone only tells half the truth. The other half was written in materials meant to be temporary, by people considered disposable, about moments that felt insignificant. But temporary can last millennia if no one bothers to destroy it. Disposable can become precious when later eyes recognize value that earlier ones missed. And insignificant moments, accumulated across millions of lives, reveal more about who we were, who we are, than any monument ever could. The gods still stride across temple walls, the kings still proclaim eternal victory. But beneath them, around them, in the margins they never controlled, the chorus continues. Quiet voices insisting on their own significance, ordinary people refusing to disappear. The Egypt history tried to erase, still here, still speaking, still waiting for anyone willing to listen.